From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I'm Jim Billington, the Librarian of Congress. I want to welcome you to this. Keep coming in. I'm just a filler here. So I want to welcome you to this conference here in America's oldest federal cultural institution. It was built around Thomas Jefferson's library, which you can see restored up on the mezzanine floor at some time during the day. Anyhow, that library around which this library has grown embodies the very subject of our meeting here today, the ideal of a knowledge-based democracy. This event results from a happy collaboration between the Library of Congress and the Carnegie Corporation of New York. We at the library were planning to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the historic legislation of 1862 that created our unique land-grant universities, thanks to its amazing author, Justin Morrill. Vartan Gregorian is a great friend and energizer of higher education who has led a major research library, an outstanding university, and now the foundation set up by Andrew Carnegie. He envisaged in this an even wider canvas, and he helped organize it. And indeed, he has been the co-convener, and we welcome him and appreciate him very much for the sesquicentennial celebration that we're having today. And many of his ideas are embodied in today's program. We are also, at all time, in Congress's library, grateful to the Congress of the United States, which has been the greatest patron of the library in the history of the world. And especially to Senator Leahy, who will open in a moment, and Senator Alexander and Representative Holt for participating in the program. We're grateful to Dr. Gregorian and the Carnegie Corporation for funding it, to President Ralph Cicerone of the National Academy of Sciences, to Peter McPherson, and the many presidents of land-grant universities who are here today. And finally, to the distinguished array of speakers who will be speaking. Justin Morrill created the blueprint for America's first continent-wide infrastructure for higher education. And he did this as a relative new member of the House of Representatives. He continued effectively to advance the cause of a knowledge-based democracy throughout the longest tenure of any member of Congress during the first century and a half of its existence. And his achievements were remarkable for someone who came from a relatively small community in a relatively small state. He had almost no formal education beyond the primary level, and he became seriously involved in politics only in his 40s. He neither sought nor attained the leadership of either house of Congress. He chaired only 2 congressional committees, each for 1 year, and he did, however, chair of the Senate Committee on Public Buildings and Grounds for 7 years. Coy Cross has written a short biography of Morrill using the large collection of Morrill papers and other manuscript resources here at the Library of Congress and in Vermont. But there is more scholarly work to be done, and no one has yet written a popular book for the general public. Perhaps this is because Morrill's life does not provide the kind of colorful detail that might have brightened up the blurbs on a book cover. He was not born in a log cabin. He did not have a flamboyant personality. He was not involved in any public illegalities or private infidelities. But just consider for a moment a basic chronological list of his accomplishments. First, in the 1850s, he crystallized several decades of uncoordinated agitation for broadening higher education in America into a single, enormously sophisticated act of national legislation. It offered each state substantial federal land if it would create, within 5 years, at least one new type of university. offering courses of study in the agricultural and mechanical arts, in addition to, not at the expense of, but in addition to the traditional liberal arts. Secondly, he displayed extraordinary personal and legislative skills, interpersonal skills, in getting both the Senate and the House to pass the Morrill Act relatively quickly in 1858. Then, after President Buchanan vetoed it, he got it passed a second time, substantially unchanged in 1862 when President Lincoln signed it into law. Morrill was extending to higher education the great American tradition of adding without subtracting. In effect, he was helping validate a new and distinctively American type of locally based university, built around the library and the laboratory rather than just the classroom and a fixed, limited body of inherited classics. And all of this happened prior to and largely independent of the move in older universities towards the German-type research university. Third, and perhaps the least studied of Morrill's contribution to a distinctively American higher education was his unwavering insistence that these broadened educational opportunities must be made available to everyone. In a series of major speeches preparing the way for the Second Morrill Act of 1890, he suggested that the future of American democracy depended on making higher education directly accessible to an ever expanding student population, particularly specifying that it should include those who previously lacked educational opportunities. He spoke first of African Americans, newly liberated, but needing these opportunities, and then of waves of immigrants, new waves, coming from places that had not had much previous contact with the United States, and neglected Native Americans who'd been here long before anyone else. Now, a fourth and even less known accomplishment of Morrill was the role he played in enshrining the pursuit of knowledge here on Capitol Hill, making the shrine accessible also, and even inspirational for everyone. Without Justin Morrill's skill in finance, advocacy, and advancing legislation with his colleagues, America might never have gotten this unique Jefferson building that we are meeting in today. Morrill played a key role in gaining the appropriation that moved the Library of Congress out of its long incubation within the Capitol building itself into its first ever independent building. He also helped bring to Washington the famed landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, done Central Park and so many other things, who designed a beautified overall Capitol Hill complex. As chair of the Buildings and Grounds Committee, Morrill was instrumental in promoting a vision of a re-landscaped Capitol Hill complex, which would have both a gorgeous new library building and the Capitol building itself as its dual centerpieces. Now, of course, many other Americans contributed to all the changes that advanced the cause of a knowledge-based democracy during Morrill's long lifetime. Andrew Carnegie's pioneering philanthropy in the private sector made challenge grants to cities and towns throughout the United States that paralleled the challenge grants to states that Morrill had created in the public sector. In both cases, a kind of crossover fiscal federalism was at work. Carnegie used his private fortune to build public libraries for urban communities, so long as their elected officials committed to support and sustain them locally. Morrill used the value of national public lands to leverage elected officials at the state level to create new universities that taught more subjects, needed bigger libraries, and often also sought supplementary private support. The projections on the screen, which I hope you've been seeing, are designed to illustrate some of the geographical spread of these two great giants in creating new educational opportunities. This gives you some idea of how the land grants developed, just as the previous one began racking up the enormous number of Carnegie libraries that were created and still exist in most cases. Now, let me suggest in conclusion how it seems to me that Morrill was able to become one of the most substantive and consequential members of Congress in the second half of the 19th century. First of all, he was securely rooted in his family, community, state, and nation, where he lived. To put it simply, he learned how to count, and he knew what counted. He mastered early in life all aspects of basic economics as the purchaser, budgeter, bookkeeper, and marketer of a general store. He then made his mark early with congressional colleagues by introducing detailed but highly intelligible statistics into his presentations and conversations. And in fact, he skillfully authored the tariff bill as one of several which helped finance the Civil War itself. Now, Morrill was also thoroughly steeped in a moral code higher than that of political expediency, well before he got into the arena. His early and enduring role models were Jedediah Harris, a local judge of legendary integrity in Vermont, Daniel Webster in the Senate, and the heroes of the Bible. Like Lincoln, whom Morrill greatly admired and supported as he, Morrill, moved from the Whig to the new Republican Party of Lincoln. Morrill had a deeply Christian faith without any clear denominational commitment, like, in a way, Lincoln himself. He generally worshiped in the least dogmatic church available, Congregationalist in Vermont, Unitarian in Washington. Like the Founding Fathers, Morrill was basically educated by a combination of practical experience in the real economy of his state and by his continuous reading of imaginative, wide-ranging literature of all kinds. His two earliest mentors in Stafford, Vermont were the skilled farmer, Jedediah Harris, and his own blacksmith father, Nathaniel, who had a very richly equipped place in which he worked. They aroused young Justin's preteen interest in agriculture and the mechanical arts, respectively. And Morrill became increasingly involved in both the A&Ms well before he made them the beneficiaries of his legislation. He began at age 15 his long, full-time work in the general store business. And whenever he came back to Vermont from his purchasing trips to Portland, where things were flooding in from all over, he brought back a great variety and quantity of things not available in the landlocked area in which he lived. These were not just, however, goods for his store, but also books for his growing library, which actually eventually acquired the name of Harris himself. Anyhow, this brings me to a third element in Morrill's formula for success in Congress. In addition to his prior practical experience in the economy and the continuous mind-extending experience of reading, I would presume to call it his reincarnation of the commitment that the Founding Fathers had to a dialogue-based culture. Those who put the United States together in the first place often began their day with reading as soon as they had natural light, then spent much of the day in the productive economy, and finally spent the late afternoon and evening both speaking and listening to others in their community who had generally also been reading other books, working in other ways than they had been. The generation, excuse me, the generation that gained independence and launched our country talked with each other over tea, rum, or dinner. Incidentally, it was rum more than anything else. Capacity, alcoholic intake capacity per capita was 3 times what it is today, and it's by no means incidental in our own time. Anyhow, they argued in taverns, but also in churches, town meetings, and they generally left women out of the conversation. But the net effect was to express face-to-face, and often bluntly, their special problems and concerns, and to begin exploring common solutions through local laws, or at least ground rules, for a civil and civilized community. That was what was happening and began happening in Morrill's enlarged general store, which became the leading gathering place for blunt local talk and debate during his nearly 4 decades in the private sector in Vermont. And it was that interpersonal skill in dialogue that Morrill brought into the public sector during his more than 4 decades as an effective congressman in Washington. The United States needed more than ever before to bring Americans back together after we had torn ourselves apart in the uncivil war that killed more people than any other conflict in the entire century anywhere on the planet between the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the outbreak of World War I. President Lincoln uplifted America at Gettysburg by suggesting that out of it all would come a new birth of freedom. Morrill had put through a law suggesting that freedom had to be fortified with education to be sustainable. That was in the year 1862 that we're commemorating here today. Lincoln widened America's horizon that same year by signing the Homestead and Pacific Railway Acts. He left us all a vision for the future in the Gettysburg and second inaugural address. In signing the Land Grant College Act in 1862, he helped fortify, in a particularly traumatic time, an enduring American dream that if more people have more access to more knowledge to use in more ways and with and for other people, whatever the problems of today, tomorrow can still be better than yesterday. We will discuss aspects of that dream here today, pay homage to Lincoln at his memorial, and then return to this building, which is itself a kind of memorial to Morrill. And you'll have the opportunity to see original materials from the collections here in the Library of Congress documenting Lincoln, Morrill, Carnegie, and others who helped build the infrastructure for a modern knowledge-based democracy. Now it's my honor and pleasure to turn the welcoming session over to someone who, like Morrill, is a highly respected, long-serving senator from Vermont, the Honorable Patrick Leahy. He is second in seniority in the Senate today, chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, a senior member of the Agriculture and Appropriations Committees, and also the oldest committee that has members from both houses of Congress, namely the Joint Committee on the Library of Congress. He introduced last Wednesday night a resolution co-sponsored by Senator Sanders of Vermont that officially opened the celebration of the 150th anniversary of the Morrill Act. He is himself an extremely knowledgeable and admiring successor to the tradition of Morrill. He embodies many of the same New England and Vermont-rooted virtues. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Patrick Leahy.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jim. Being here with you, with Mrs. Billington, with your daughter, and with all the others, it's just, you know, it's great. I get a thrill every time I walk into the Library of Congress. I remember as a young law student at Georgetown, back when it was just down the street, coming up here to study, to use the law library here, and but taking time just to walk from the building where the law library was into this building, just to walk around and enjoy it. I must also say that I'm delighted that you are here because my office in the Capitol was once part of the Library of Congress. It has a great view down the mall, and while it was nice to have the library there, I enjoy using it now. But this is the 150th anniversary of the Morrill Act, and what a great way to start the week. Justin Morrill and his legacy are a great source of pride for all Vermonters. I feel privileged to hold the seat that he once held. I consider him one of the greatest, if not the greatest, of all Vermonters. And being here, Jim, it was great of you to invite me. I should mention that Dr. Billington and I have been friends for several decades, and we go way back to traveling in Russia, and fortunately he could speak Russian. And then when we got to Georgia, in the then Soviet Union, we found the Georgians didn't want to speak Russian to the Russians, but most of them spoke French, so I finally felt I had a language I could carry on conversations with. We have members of the delegation from the University of Vermont's Proctor Maple Research Center, Tim Perkins and Tim Wilmot, Emily Drew, George Cook, Brian Stowe. They're going to host a display at the Smithsonian's Folklife Festival. So these are all, so much comes together here. And I encourage you all to take a look at the great research being done at the University of Vermont. Go to Morrill Hall, for example. And we thank the staff of the Library of Congress for letting us use this magnificent and historic venue that so aptly reflects the legacy of Justin Morrill and Abraham Lincoln and the signing of the Morrill Act 150 years ago. So I look forward to that. The Folklife Festival this week will showcase the historic contributions to our nation's landscape. And I look forward to when Dr. Billington will join me in Vermont at the Morrill Homestead Symposium in August. I think you'll see a lot of what shaped this wonderful man when you see where he lived. He's a tried and true Vermonter. He was born in Stratford in 1810. He later started the procedure that only native-born Vermonters could be elected to the United States Senate, something that was not in our Constitution, but was in our practice from the mid-1800s up until just a few years ago. I am a native Vermonter, I hasten to add. That you'll find when you come to Vermont is sometimes a source of pride, but fortunately we have a lot of people who moved into our state and made it an even better state. But he grew up in a modest household, but he had aspirations. He knew he wanted to go to college, even though he was told time and time again it was not possible. And he had to leave school at the age of 15. But Justin Morrill, like Abraham Lincoln, became an emblem of the lifelong learner. He was self-educated in business and architecture, horticulture, and politics. He entered public service in 1854. He served in both the U.S. House and the Senate for almost 44 years, the third longest serving senator in Vermont's history. And Justin Morrill, as Dr. Billington indicated, as Congressman Morrill, introduced the Morrill Land Grant Act at a time of great divide in the country in 1862, a nation at war. But Senator Morrill saw past these deep and bloody divisions. He wanted to promote higher education through the use of government land grants. This was nation building on a grand and novel scale. When I look at the chart up there, you go from up in the far northeast corner of Maine down to the Marianas as a result of this. And as logical as the idea seems to us today, is just part of who we are as a nation, the idea was fresh, practical, American idea. It was considered radical at that fragile moment in our nation's young life when fathers were fighting sons and brothers were fighting brothers. Justin Morrill saw an opportunity to expand individual opportunity, to strengthen communities in the nation. He wanted ordinary Americans to have the chance for formal education that he never had. And it's difficult to overstate the profound ways the Morrill Act has improved the lives of countless Americans. It's enriched this nation land-grant institutions have opened the doors of affordable and accessible higher education to millions of students. What would this country be without it? I mean, this was a major turning point in our nation. I've seen these successes firsthand at the University of Vermont, but whatever state you're from, you could say similar things. These institutions are the lifeblood of the community, hubs of research and innovation, drivers of economic growth, laboratories for critical thinking, and in many ways, most importantly, a place for public discourse. Innovative research done in these universities not only educates students, promotes the exchange of new ideas, it improves agriculture and industrial enhancements and our way of life. And think of how it's gone far from our shores. Land-grant colleges have had an incalculable impact on food security around the globe. For decades, these universities have helped poor and underdeveloped countries gain stability by providing them with technical assistance and educational outreach, improved technology, agricultural practices, and most importantly, hands-on instruction. Now, the Leahys came to Vermont in the 1800s. I was the first Leahy to attend college and get a college degree. My sister, the second. I understand Senator Morrill's commitment to public education, and the stirrings he felt to give others a gift he never had. My father, at the similar age, had to leave school to support his family and became a self-taught historian and believed so strongly in education as Morrill did. And Jim, I should tell you, when my parents, when they were still with us, one of the greatest joys coming to Washington was come to the Library of Congress and talk about what you have here. But Senator Morrill's commitment to higher education, his passion for agriculture, a testament to his character. And we did pass that resolution celebrating the 150th anniversary of the signing of the first Morrill Act at a time when some would say in the Senate we probably couldn't pass a resolution saying the sun rises in the east. This was passed unanimously. So it's a great honor to be a link in the chain of appreciation for the legacy of this celebrated fellow Vermonter. But especially here at the Library of Congress, what better place, I was going to say in the country, what better place in the world to do that? So have a great conference today. I'm going down to fulfill my role as one of the regents of the Smithsonian, another great institution here in Washington. And but I'll have people from my office here, and we'll hear about this conference. Thank you for letting me be here. I appreciate it. Feels like old time.
Senator, the land grant and public universities of this country, thank you for spearheading the resolution yesterday or 2 days ago in the Senate, and for all the work that you've done over these many years. Senator, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Well, to begin with, let me thank Dr. Billington and Dr. Gregorian for seeing what might be done here, how this all could be tied together, and we're so very pleased to work with them on this program today. It really is just an excellent history, really inspirational to us all. Today, this morning, we're going to work further, think further about the history. And so we have a panel who, if they would come up now, I think they're all right here. Let me introduce them. Each of them will speak just a few minutes. And then after they speak, we'll open it up to questions and comments. I know there are a number of presidents of universities here that will want to add something to this history. I expect that we'll have a lively discussion. We're recording this. We'll see what we can do with it all. The first to speak will be Dr. Luana Simon, who's president of Michigan State University, Michael Adams, president of University of Georgia, Ed Ray, president of Oregon State, Mary Sias, president of Kentucky State University, David Yarlott, president of Little Bighorn College. There are three major concepts that drove the Morrill Act and a bunch of the other agenda, the non-war agenda of Lincoln, if you will. One was the democracy and opportunity. Dr. Billington talked about it extensively. It really came from the Declaration of Independence on through. A college for the sons and daughters of ordinary people was a logical next step in this whole intellectual process, nationhood building, if you will. The second concept was that the federal government had a role in economic development. Now, that wasn't a given as we started off. I mean, in some ways, it was a fight. It was Hamilton's idea for a national bank, for the assumption of state debt so as to establish national credit. We don't ordinarily associate that idea with Morrill, but in fact, it was the concept the federal government had a role in economic development. Of course, Henry Clay, with his ideas, his American plan for harbors, roads, canals, and so forth to tie the country together, again, was a federal government role. And Lincoln and Morrill were both Whigs, which Clay was, and on the record showed great admiration for Clay. They were a little younger, obviously, but were part of the Clay set of ideas. So you had this federal action as a function. And the third concept that drove all this was that there's a growing feeling that we needed to have scientific, technical education to help build the country. Yields in the East and South particularly were falling, and scientific agriculture, in fact, was more broadly used in Europe and was increasing yields. Also, remember, the country was industrializing. It was on the farm where more machinery was used, but beyond. So hence we had a school program proposed as to scientific agriculture, mechanical arts, engineering, and of course the Act talks about basically humanities. It was a democratization of education, of higher education. And it all came together as part of a stream of ideas and a building of the country. So on this 150th anniversary, let's talk a little about it by region. Each of these folks will represent their various regions or their history of certain kinds of institution that are also land grants. And Luana, would you begin, please?
I'd be delighted. It really is a pleasure to be here. It was interesting that there was much ferment in the North and in the Northeast regarding the need for agriculture to be viewed differently in productivity as well as in the world economy. So the State Agricultural Society of Michigan, when meeting in 1850, looked with envy upon the European nations' establishment of agricultural schools and model farms where distinguished scientists lectured and discoveries were made. And at that point petitioned the federal government more formally to establish agricultural colleges. They were joined in 1853 by the state of Illinois, Jonathan Baldwin Turner as that advocate, encouraging that these agricultural colleges would be established well before the Morrill Act and in conversations with Justin Morrill. Now, when we talk about this today, there are some lessons to be learned, I think, and some interesting conversations, because the Agricultural College of the state of Michigan was created to go beyond being a farming trade school and to include things like agricultural chemistry and the thirst for transmission to common people across the state as a practical tool, not simply a burnishment of the pedigree of the elite. Now, there was a tension at this point between some farmers and the state board that there was too much liberal education and too much attention to the moral character and mental faculties of our students, and that this curriculum was not to be intended as this ethereal thing, but much more practical work in agriculture, and that we shouldn't be encouraging people to leave the farm, something that you might hear today if you're a part of a land-grant institution. So this hybrid college struggled a bit in its founding, and the first president, after being it was also iffy in a financial sense, as we struggled, and the college was in debt after its founding in 1858, $13,000 in debt, and that caused the first president to resign after going to Washington unsuccessfully to work with Justin Morrill and others to see if they could get this federal support from Michigan State University, at that time the Agricultural College. So there was also criticism of the farmers at this point, because the program had become way too ethereal. The students were actually asked to build buildings and do things in engineering instead of simply learning to farm. And they had this sort of sense about the liberal arts that was not quite the right thing. So there was a real tension after the president resigned in debt and with this curricular discussion that we should go back to a 2-year program, and that should be taken over by the University of Michigan.
No.
It's true. It's a true story. And so there was some legislative action. The last legislative action was done in 1869, interestingly. That was the attempt to move this agricultural entity back into the University of Michigan, because the University of Michigan had been founded by a grant of land that was federal land, so it seemed to make sense. But the university survived all of that initial tensions, and those discussions about finances and curriculum and how balanced you are still there today. And they were able to introduce the first curriculum in scientific agriculture in 1865, really a period of time and evolution that became the grounding of Michigan State. 5 years later, we were able to make the payment from the Morrill Act in 1870, become more financially solvent, admitted women in our first class in 1880, admitted the first international student from Japan. So there's always some discussion about who was first. The Michigan folks will say that their actions in 1850 made us first in terms of moving forward in a formal petition for the land-grant institution, followed by Illinois in 1853. Iowa was the first state legislature to accept the provisions of the Morrill Act in September 11th of 1862, which is now Iowa State, becoming the first land-grant college in 1864. The first land-grant institution created under the Act was Kansas State in 1863, and the oldest is actually Rutgers, founded in 1776, but became designated as a land-grant in 1864. But the real big argument is between Penn State and Michigan State. Football prevails at all times, with both institutions, state legislatures establishing the charters in February of 1855, Michigan State 10 days earlier. But the federal government on the centennial for the Morrill Act decided not to argue about 10 days, so Michigan State and Penn State are both represented on the stamp of the centennial. We opened our doors in 1857, and the Farmers High School of Pennsylvania began in 1859. So this is a glorious history with a lot of current day relevance.
Good work, good work. Michael.
Can't match that. Or maybe I can. But, at the end of Mississippian William Faulkner's novel, Absalom, Absalom, Quentin Compson, who was the scion of that once great but now declining Mississippi family, and then a student at Harvard, is asked by his Canadian roommate, Shreve McCannon, "Why do you hate the South?" "I don't hate it," he replies quickly, and then again, "I don't hate it." But he repeats the mantra in his mind and verbally several times as if trying to convince himself of its truth. The fact that Compson's family had to send him north for a good education lies at the heart of both the need for and the Morrill Act's impact on Southern education and on the South itself. Prior to the Civil War, or the War of Northern Aggression, as one historical marker on my campus reads, the South was functionally non-industrial, an agrarian society rich in raw materials but utterly dependent on the northern states for production. It was an educational backwater with a number of state universities established but operating with very low enrollments of a few hundred students at most, including the University of Georgia, chartered in 1785. It was a two-class society built on the backs of slaves and sharecroppers, which perpetuated wealth for a very few, who were the chief beneficiaries of the narrow window of opportunity for a college education for a few. Higher education in the 18th and 19th century in Georgia and in most of the South was a private and a personal good. The Morrill Act, in my mind, along with some others, is what revolutionized American higher education by positing the radical idea that there is a public benefit to higher education that extends well beyond the good that inures to the recipient of the degree. If you'll allow me just a bit of self-serving rhetoric, the charter for the University of Georgia, the oldest public charter in the nation, and we in Chapel Hill argue about which is the oldest public. Our usual response is we were chartered first. They actually taught classes first. We took the time necessary to get it right. Approved by the state legislature in 1785, the charter articulated a vision for higher education that was clear in its assertion that society benefited from higher education. Taken together with the Morrill Act, which provided the necessary federal funding to implement this ideal, the UGA Charter is another foundation of American public higher education. The Charter states that the people's public prosperity and even existence very much depends upon suitably forming and framing the minds and morals of their citizens, a very revolutionary idea in 18th century Georgia in a largely agrarian-based economy. The Georgia General Assembly was under the strongest obligation, the Charter says, to form the youth, the rising hope of our land, to render like glorious and essential services to our country. Georgia then, in the 18th century, in many ways led the South and the nation away from the concept of higher education as a private and limited good. There is a strong populist streak in Georgia politics even today, and this view of education is at the core of that belief system. When President Lincoln signed the Morrill Act in 1862, however, Georgia and the rest of the South was, shall we say, otherwise engaged. Most of its universities were in the process of closing, as students, faculty, and in our case, even trustees signed up to fight the North. Secession left the South with no industrial partner to convert its bounteous raw materials into marketable goods, and the war itself left it with no recovery infrastructure. No region in the country, even as they had fought it, was in greater need of the promise of the Morrill Act than the South itself in the latter half of the 19th century and into the early years of the 20th. The Morrill Act, I believe, gives voice to an ideal of access and equity, of promise and potential, of impact and influence. It joins other voices who have spoken in Georgia and in the South similar messages. The voice of Henry Grady, editor of the Atlanta Constitution and the most vocal advocate for a new South after the Civil War, who urged his readers to form partnerships with investors from the North, to develop industrial capacity, to diversify agricultural practices, and to support higher education. The voice of the GI Bill, maybe the most important act in American education in the South, given the number of Southerners in World War II, which made a college degree possible for tens of thousands of servicemen and women returning from the war, a direct result of educating more people and testimony to the spirit of the UGA Charter and to the Morrill Act. There was a public benefit. And then the voice of Martin Luther King and progressive Atlanta Mayor Ivan Allen in the mid to late 20th century, who spoke the simple truth that the nation had not lived up to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, and until it did, would not prosper. We are proud in Georgia that while we certainly did not do many things anywhere near perfectly during that era, through thoughtful visionary leadership, we worked out the issues of the civil rights movement with much less violence and ugliness than many other southern states. It is why I believe today, among other regions, Atlanta is the capital of the South and remains the economic engine for the region today. The question for us today is what voice will lead us forward in this knowledge-based economy, with our funding partners increasingly shifting toward the view that education, again, is a private, not a public good. It is crystal clear that the University of Georgia has become, through the Hope Scholarship, in many ways a descendant of the Morrill Act, and private support and integration with economic development efforts, one of the leading institutions in the South. It would not be in that position today, I can assure you, without the Morrill Act, whose influx of cash in the late 1800s, we actually re-entered the Morrill Act group in 1872. That influx of federal money probably saved the institution at a time that the state was destitute following the Civil War. Every Southerner today knows the power of the land. Faulkner spoke of his postage stamp of native soil. The first or second question you'll be asked in a conversation in the South even today is, where are you from? The fact then that the Morrill Act's initial impact resulted from the sale of land or soil makes it truly a Southern act of Congress as well. Even though many Southern legislators at the time, over fear of federal control of education, opposed the Morrill Act as the first step onto a slippery slope, our institutions at the South were probably those, if you look at the whole scope of things, that have benefited the most from its promise. It is my hope as we move forward that we could return again to the notion that the Morrill Act and higher education in general is both a public and a private good.
Yay.
Thank you, Michael. Ed?
Good morning. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with each of you today to participate in the celebration of the 150th anniversary of the Morrill Act. It's been quite a century and a half for the part of the history that I've been asked to talk about, the states west of the Mississippi. Actually, I was hoping that our speaking time would be apportioned depending upon the size of the geographical area we had to discuss, but apparently the votes weren't there. Anyway, it's been an amazing century and a half, particularly in those states that American history previously portrayed as the Wild West or the frontier, and sometimes in not very flattering terms. In my reviewing the establishment and growth, as well as the incredible contributions of the many land-grant universities located west of the Mississippi River, it is clear that these universities have richly and uniquely served the educational and economic needs of their citizens and states, as called for by the Morrill Act. But these universities also created a sense of unique connection, not only in the actual towns in which they are located, but among all people and within all regions of the states they served. President Lincoln, when he signed the Morrill Act into law, referred to the land grants as the people's colleges. The West's land-grant universities contributed profoundly to the economic development and the settlement of the western United States. They also fostered a strong and essential connection with the fabric of democracy upon which America was formed and over which our nation has engaged in several bloody wars and years of horrific civil strife. Along the way, each of the West land-grant universities contribute to a well-trained, skilled, and well-educated workforce, innovative research and discovery, impactful engagement and outreach. Each university has done so with its own cornerstone commitment and on a scale and scope that could not have been achieved in any other way. At the University of Wyoming, this commitment is embodied in an etched inscription on Old Main, the oldest standing building on that campus. That message, translated from Latin, reads, "He need not go away from home for instruction." In the West, and people in the East have trouble getting this, being place-bound is a way of life for many people. Land-grant universities across the West, however, have never been just "he's in education." At universities such as Kansas State, the University of Idaho, Washington State, and many others, a focus on equality of education of both women and men was an early-on requirement, one that predated suffrage by many decades. Over time, not only in their own name, but in focus, land-grant universities have dramatically evolved to meet the comprehensive needs of their states and to capture new academic and research opportunities. Initially, all were known as agricultural colleges or agricultural and mechanical colleges. At my own university, after being founded in 1868, 3 early-on faculty divided up teaching duties about matters such as chemistry, soils, fertilizers, drainage, mineralogy, stock breeding, grasses, injurious pests, and something called fruit culture. Their favorite textbooks, Caldwell's Agricultural Analysis, Allen's Farm Book, Goodale's Stock Breeding, and Liebig's How Plants Grow. Today, as it should, agriculture, along with forestry and engineering, remains an important focus among us. But so are the marine sciences and geology at the University of Hawaii and the University of Alaska, computer sciences and computing at South Dakota State and the University of California, Berkeley, the ecology of a national wonder, Yellowstone Park at Montana State, aerospace sciences at New Mexico State, space exploration at the University of Arizona, renewable energy alternatives at Colorado State and Oklahoma State, and emerging natural resources issues at Cal Davis, the University of Nebraska, and North Dakota State. And each of these universities provides essential and rich education and research in the liberal arts and in business. And several offer nationally ranked teaching and research in medicine, law, education, veterinary medicine, pharmacy, criminal justice, and public health. Several of these institutions have 2 or more designations as land and sea grant universities, or as land, sea, and space grant universities. And one, Oregon State, is one of the nation's only 2 land, sea, sun, and space grant universities. Since 1862, the West has changed significantly. It has matured, and so has the economy. 6 shooters are no longer carried, at least not without a license or a concealed weapons permit, and certainly not on most university campuses. As our state's populations have grown, we all have been benefited by racial and cultural diversity. Yes, the West has changed. Looking ahead, our mission remains to improve the lives of those we serve throughout our states, our nation, and the world in powerful and positive ways through the excellence of our graduates, our research and creative work, and our outreach and engagement efforts. Thank you.
before we move on to Mary's comments about the 1890s, let me make a couple comments about the Northeast schools. The Northeast had very strong, or relative to the rest of the country, strong private institutions. And many faculty in places like Yale and some in Harvard and so forth argued that science needed to be more broadly taught. Certainly those were emerging in those institutions. And so they played a part in the land grant. In fact, MIT is a land grant and is a very active member of APLU, actually very active. Brown was originally a land grant, but then it really was counterculture, I think, at least at that time, in terms of the science and ag and so forth. It was a struggle within Massachusetts as to whether it was going to be just MIT or, and ultimately, Amherst, University of Massachusetts, was where the land grant was added. So what you had, what you had in the East was more privates, and powerful privates, and what role they were going to play, and they continue to play, of course, a huge role in that part of the country. Generally, it came down to all states had a public land grant, but from the beginning, I think there was more emphasis, certainly at Amherst, on science education than there was automatically in other parts of the country. Note Luana's comments on those early years in Michigan, where the farming community was an important driver and controller of what Michigan State would ultimately be. Mary?
Well, good morning. I'm from Kentucky State University, one of this nation's 1890 land-grant institutions. And my job this morning is to continue the story and talk about the impact of the Morrill Act on the 1890 land-grant development. This is a story that is a little bit different, and you may not be as familiar with it as you are with the 1862s. The way in which a society is able to structure and allocate educational opportunity shapes the lives of the people in that society, and indeed, the very character of that society. The signing of the 1862 Morrill Act made it possible for each state to receive federal funds to establish state college or university. And the Morrill Act singularly democratized higher education in this country. But there was a major problem when the 1862 legislation was enacted. You might ask, what was that? Slavery still existed in the United States. It was extremely rare for freed slaves to attend northern schools, and generally, that didn't happen in the South either. The majority of black slaves in this country lived in the South. This meant they continued to be enslaved well after the Emancipation Proclamation. So even at the close of the Civil War in 1865, it was still considered a criminal offense for blacks to be educated. It was still considered a criminal offense. Any blacks were then prohibited from going to 1862 schools. Now, the Morrill Act also did not divide funds along racial lines, so there were generally no institutions established as 1890 land grants, with the exception of Alcorn Agricultural and Mechanical College, now known as Alcorn State University. And I'm going to digress for a minute and tell you something I thought about as I was writing these remarks. I'm from Mississippi, and so are my parents and my grandparents and my husband's family, and Alcorn is in Mississippi. When they grew up in Mississippi, blacks could not go past the 8th grade unless they had money to go to private school. So my parents only have 8th grade education. I'm a first-generation college graduate, and my 31-year-old daughter is a second-generation college graduate. On my husband's side, His mother finished 8th grade, and her father got her to Alcorn. Like many 1890 land grants at the time, they had high schools. She went to high school there, finished, went on to college because he wanted her to get as much education as she could, met her husband there, and they both graduated from Alcorn in 1932. I have great nieces and nephews on his side who are 4th generation college graduates. They're doctors, PhDs, and engineers. A big difference for two people who grew up in Mississippi that one university made. And I dare say, for everyone who went through Alcorn State University, the thousands of blacks, you had a tremendous difference in their life and the life of their extended families. Now, sorry about the digression, getting back to the story. There were 2 other schools that you probably know about. Hampton Institute, now Hampton University, that got money from the first Morrill Act. And it really started what we know as extension work and began to send people back into the community. Hampton turned over its land grant status to Virginia State University. There was also, and I didn't realize this, Claflin, private, and South Carolina State University took its land grant status name. That was the beginning for us. But it took 28 more years for the second Morrill Act to pass in 1890. And that came about because even though blacks were not generally going to school under the 1862 Morrill Act, there was a realization that black citizens had to be educated. But this act was a little bit different. There was no grant of land. What happened was funding was authorized from the sale of land, and it came from the sale of public lands. $15,000 to each state within 1890, and $1,000 a year for the next 10 years up to a maximum of $25,000. A little bit of a difference, don't you think? Well, in order for those states to receive that money, they had to either allocate the money so that blacks could go to the school, or separate black colleges were built to serve them. This group of 1890 schools became the nucleus of a new phrase at the time, historically black colleges and universities, that we now fondly call HBCUs. The 1890 schools are located in the South and the border states, and they have faced tremendous challenges and hardships during the 1890s and after that. Because you see, 90% of African Americans in the South were farmers, 84% of them were overseers, sharecroppers, or employed in domestic jobs. The rule of the land at the time was separate but equal. And until the 1960s, that continued to be the rule of the land. I can assure you that rarely was it equal. So most 1890s, rather than creating researchers and scientists, had their curriculum set for liberal arts and to train teachers. And in fact, most schools were normal institutions. Mine was. Now, I couldn't talk about the 1890s without talking about a school we all know. While not a public institution, Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University, was able to receive funding. It had a curriculum similar to that of land-grant schools, and when the Hatch Act passed in 1887, Alabama State Legislature established an experiment station, and Tuskegee went about having fun. And in 1899, the U.S. Congress granted Tuskegee 25,000 acres of land and an annual appropriation. What I find really interesting about Tuskegee is that you had George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington there. Washington hired Carver, and he put him in charge of what they called a movable school. It was a stagecoach. And they put materials in there, so every weekend they would go out to do these demonstrations in the rural counties. They had one of the first farm conferences that drew over 500 African American farmers from all across Alabama. And this really is thought to be the spark that ignited the extension work in the United States. So we have to give Washington and Carver both credit for that. The 1890 schools were asked to cooperate with the 1862 counterparts and to extend those extension benefits. But only the 1862s were provided the funding, and then they passed it on to us. Now, it would take me most of this morning to go through every act to tell you how often that happened, that the 1862s got the money, and then they gave it on to the 1890s, but usually a fair share didn't go to us. So when you wonder about what happened with the research and other things, we often did not have the resources necessary to do that work. But we've accomplished a lot. The strength of the American democratic experiment lies in the aspiration to afford all citizens fair opportunity to be educated. And nothing has done that better than the Morrill Act, both the 1862 and the 1890. On our campuses, you'll see programs like urban forestry. I think Alabama A&M has the only PhD on the HBCU campuses in forestry. I am an institution that's 2,800 in Kentucky, the smallest comprehensive institution. But my program of distinction is aquaculture. And consistently, we rank in the top 5 in the nation in aquaculture. Not something you would expect. Not at all. And so it doesn't matter wherever I am in the world, but if I'm in China or Japan, what they want to know about is what we're doing in aquaculture. It might be nutrition or sustainability or plant and animal science, or I saw George Wright earlier, and they have, and so does Alcorn, strong goat programs as well. You might laugh, but a lot of people in the world are eating goat meat. And this year is the first year where more than half of the country eats more fish than beef. So don't laugh about aquaculture. So when you think about the story of the 1890 land grants, you have to think about the fact that it afforded a different group of people a chance for their dreams to come true. People who often look like me, or my family, or my mother-in-law, who was 100 years old when she died 3 years ago. So I heard these stories directly from her. It gave people a chance to dream about a better life, to have an opportunity to have that life. In a speech in 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson was at the University of Michigan, and he talked about the Great Society. And he said, "The challenge is whether we have the wisdom to use the wealth to enrich and elevate our national life and advance the quality of our American civilization. I would add that it is the imagination, initiative, creativity, and yes, even sometimes the indignation of our founders and of the 1890 schools that will continue to help this nation move forward as we deal with our changing demographics. That means that we need institutions like our 1890s to educate all the people who will be coming forth looking to fulfill their dreams." President Johnson also reminded us that the mark of a great society is that it is not a safe harbor, a resigned place, a final objective, a finished work. It is a challenge constantly renewed, beckoning us toward a destiny where the meanings of our lives match the marvelous products of our labor. Those words describe the transforming power and potential of land-grant institutions, both the 1862s and the 1890s, created by the passage of the Morrill Act that we celebrate here today. Thank you.
David?
Go ahead. Malaysia Malakis Sashu. Biopsalg. Biwudsig. Biwudshwagari. I think it's appropriate as we talk about history and education that I introduce myself in my native language, because historically, learning was passed down orally amongst my people. In 1980, my tribe established Little Bighorn College with the goal of creating a lasting tradition of higher education, a solid path into the future for the Apsalalooke people. I am proud to say that I am a product of my tribe's commitment to higher education. As a student, I attended Little Bighorn College, eventually earning an associate's degree. As a faculty member, I taught at the college. Later, after earning advanced degrees from Montana State University, another land-grant institution, I became an administrator. Now, as president of Little Bighorn College, it is my responsibility to keep clearing the path into the future for my people, a path that includes new technologies, native science, and partnerships in education research, including new agriculture and land use partnerships. I do not know how well acquainted you are with tribal colleges, so I will try to give you a brief sketch of our institutions. American Indian tribally chartered colleges are public institutions of higher education that young and geographically isolated, primarily located on federal trust land or Indian reservations. We are chartered by our tribes for the dual purposes of educating our people and preserving our culture, our language, and our lands. Located in some of the most impoverished regions of this country, in fact, 7 of the 10 poorest counties in the nation have tribal colleges. TCUs are planting resilient seeds of hope for the future, nurturing and sustaining languages, cultures, and traditions, and helping to strengthen tribal economies and governments. The tribal college philosophy is simple. To succeed, American Indian higher education must be locally and culturally based, holistic, and supportive. The education system must address the whole person: mind, body, spirit, family, and community. The first Morrill Act was enacted in 1862, specifically to bring education to the people. Today, 150 years later, the 1994 institutions, more so than many other institutions of higher education, epitomized the original intent of the first land-grant legislation. We are truly place-based and community-based institutions. In 1994, the tribal colleges took a step toward greater participation in the American higher education system. During the second session of the 103rd Congress, American Indian reservations became the last lands under the American flag to receive land-grant status. This historic and long overdue recognition occurred with the passage of the Equity in Educational Land-Grant Status Act. This legislation is very important to us because, as I mentioned earlier, we are people of place. Place defines who we are. Our stories, songs, and language come from the lands, waters, the mountains, plants, and wind. Most of our land, the remaining tribal land in North America, is forest or agricultural land. In fact, of the 72.8 million acres that comprise American Indians reservations, more than 75% are agricultural and forestry holdings. Tragically, due to lack of expertise and training, millions of tribal acres are fallow, underused, or the land is being developed through methods that could render resource non-renewable. This underdevelopment of agricultural potential occurs while unemployment exceeds 50% on many reservations. Through the ongoing efforts of the 1994 institutions, American Indian communities are working to turn these statistics around. Our current land grant programs are embarrassingly small, especially in relation to our fellow land grant institutions. Yet, they are very important to us. Extension and research programs are particularly important. However, in fiscal year 2012, the 1994s received only $4.2 million for all of our extension programs. That's $4.2 million spread competitively among 32 institutions, many of which serve areas much larger than several states. In comparison, the 1862s received $294 million in formula-driven extension funds in fiscal year 2012. With regard to research, the 1994s competed amongst one another for $1.8 million in funding last year. The 1862s received $236 million. Some people are uncomfortable when I provide statistics like these. Some people do not like to hear such comparisons, yet these are the facts. If the nation made a real commitment to tribal colleges and made progress toward equity, we would have the potential of becoming significant contributors to the agricultural base of the nation and the world. After all, most of our land is agriculture and forestry based, and we are already beginning to reassert sovereignty over our food, agriculture, livestock, and fishery systems. Working with key partners, we are defining policies that are ecologically, socially, and culturally appropriate to our unique circumstances. Due in large part to our land grant activities, leveraged with other STEM programs, our students are involved in cutting-edge research, particularly research related to the preservation of our natural resource and the exploration of the linkages between nutritional patterns and disease. Much of this research is conducted in partnership with other land grants. However, since our inception, mainstream institutions have regularly added our names to their grant proposals without speaking to us or notifying us that we are being used to help secure their funding. Being part of the nation's land grant system has begun to help address this practice. The 1994s are now engaging in joint research projects that are producing good science and solid partnerships. But much work remains to be accomplished. We look forward to expanding our role as truly equal partners within the land grant system. I am honored to have this opportunity to share our story with you. Thank you.
Didn't realize the funding was so low.
I didn't need it. I'd be interested in the per student. It's probably still on.
Well, thank you very much, David. As you see, there's a wonderful history here and great opportunity. Now, we've got 45 minutes to have people in the audience ask questions. There are a number of presidents out here who I think want to add a comment or two about their own institution, own history. But we've been sitting for an hour and a half. What do you think about standing up for 1 minute and then sitting down? I see out here the president of Iowa State, who was, as Luann pointed out, was an early, right after the Act, land-grant university. Steve? Sir? We got our mic here.
Yeah, we could continue that debate since we were the first school to take the terms of the Morrill Act, so I'm pleased about that. I was also proud of the fact that George Washington Carver got his PhD from Iowa State, so we have a long, proud history in the land-grant mission and look forward to the rest of this conference. I didn't have a specific question for the group right now, though.
Other questions or comments here? Right over here. We got... yeah, why don't you take one? We got mics on two sides. Oh, someone's over here. Okay.
My question to the panel is, are any of your land grant institutions doing any special advertising to recruit new students in 2012 on the 150th anniversary of the Morrill Act?
Well, I'll go first, yes. In fact, even though we had a master's in agriculture and aquaculture, we did not have an undergraduate program in that. And beginning this fall, We just got approved on Thursday for that undergraduate program, and we had over 600 high school students on board with parents and grandparents. Very interested in seeing what we do, looking at the mobile classrooms that still exist. So we're excited about this 150th anniversary celebration.
Yeah, if I could quickly, we had a study done by a group called Eco Northwest. We're in Corvallis, the University of Oregon is in Eugene, and Eco Northwest is in Eugene, so you know they didn't cut us any slack. We asked them to estimate the size of our annual economic footprint. They estimated it at over $2 billion. I've spent a lot of the winter and spring going to communities throughout Oregon, talking about the broader issue of the impact and about the university, but actually talking about the impact in their counties and in their communities and the role and the mission of the land-grant university in serving the people of the state, the nation, and the world, and encouraging them to support the university, but also send their students to us to help revitalize their communities. And that's very much in the land-grant tradition.
I can't say that we've done a lot advertising-wise, but I suspect many of the members of the audience have seen the articles in the Chronicle and other members of the academic press about the numbers of students that are now flooding to agricultural colleges because that's where the jobs are. There have been several articles in the popular press in our region of the country about the role of food safety, food processing, et cetera, and the changing nature of food that's produced in the South. You know, we've been the peach state forever. One of the interesting things that's gone on, about 20 years ago, UGA researchers discovered that we were a better climate for blueberries than peaches.
Too late.
And we, in dollar volume and in cartons, we produce now twice the blueberries that we do peaches. That would have never happened without UGA.
Twice the volume.
Without UGA research. And as usual, the kids are ahead of those on the faculty and in the general world in figuring out these things. But the whole business of new technologies, new types of farming, new types of food processing, and particularly despite the negativity associated with it, the research that's being done, I think now on E. coli and many others, are drawing increasing numbers of young people into the agricultural field, 75% of whom, in our case, are from suburban Atlanta, who've decided that there is this growing get back to the land movement. And there was also an article recently in the AJC, for the first time in like 40 years, there's been an increase in the number of family farms. Young people particularly, that are going back and establishing organic-based farming. So there are a lot of trend lines that are moving in a direction that none of us would have probably predicted 5 or 10 years ago.
I would just add that we're using the Morrill Act as a way of trying to promote the future of urban-based agriculture. And we'll be making an announcement with Mayor Bing in Detroit this week in order to think about a partnership that both empowers as well as encourages the issues of urban food systems, economic development for very poor neighborhoods, using Detroit as an example, and building that back into the schools to strengthen the high school science curriculum, because the outcome isn't always what we want it to be. And our efforts through 4-H would suggest that using Sea Grant land-based activities has helped in summer programs to improve the science and mathematics performance of some students in urban settings. So we're going to be pushing that very hard as a way to try to move us as a state forward.
For us, we haven't done anything specifically for advertising, but for this week's activities, I did bring 5 administrators, faculty, and staff, along with 8 students, to participate in the activities along the mall. And if you do have an opportunity, our staff and students will be at the booth for the tribal colleges and universities from 3 o'clock to 5:30. So on Wednesday and Thursday. So if you have an opportunity, stop by and say hi.
Okay, we're going to get some more questions and comments out here.
Peter, I've been privileged to be at 3 land grants, Oregon State and Idaho, and now at the University of California, Riverside. And indeed, the University of California is a land grant, but and every campus expresses it in different ways, but the 3 that are mostly involved in that are Davis, Berkeley, and Riverside. And you know, you were telling stories about how communities got started back in 1873. A fellow sent some cuttings from a Brazilian orange tree to Riverside to see if they would grow in that environment, and lo and behold, pretty soon there was 100 million trees from Pasadena down to Redlands. And so then the regents decided to establish a citrus experiment station in Riverside, and ultimately it became the campus. And I found the newspaper clipping when it became a campus, and I think it speaks to each of the excitement in the communities of those of you who spoke. It said that 3 days before Christmas in 1914, word came that the regents had voted to retain the experiment station in Riverside and established a new 475-acre site. Wild jubilation broke out in the streets of Riverside. Holiday shoppers danced. The steam whistle on the electric plant blew for 15 minutes. The owner of the Venerable Mission Inn ordered the bells to be rung continuously, and everybody called it the most important day in the history of Riverside. And that experiment station today fuels the majority of California's $36 billion ag industry. Over half of that is based on citrus. And so talk about economic impact across the San Joaquin Valley in Southern California. And I was sobered to listen to the comments about the colleges. I think we ought to, as an organization, say something about that, Peter.
It's a wonderful story, and thank you for giving it. Other comments, other stories?
Peter,
yes, more.
I'd like to hear some comments on the various name changes that have occurred since 1862 and the political pressures that you have had to retain agriculture in the name of the college. And secondly, I heard very little comment on home economics, I think, which was part of the legislation, agriculture, home economics, and the mechanic arts.
It certainly was. It certainly was. Mort, thank you for your comments. Others over here, I see a number of hands. Who's got the mics? Yes, sir. Okay.
My question is, are you adopting any ideas from the countries like India and China? Growing agricultural products.
Are we adopting? I couldn't
any ideas from the growing these agricultural products like India? India has so much advanced agricultural methods.
Who would like to respond?
You probably could do that, right? Peter is a strong internationalist, so and as a former president of Michigan State, that was a softball question for him. He's just giving it to me. Michigan State has really been involved since John Hanna's time in the 1950s doing food security around the world, including doing microeconomics in India for a very long time. So I think there's a lot of partnerships that we can develop. The next stage, I think, of development for the land grants is really not simply bilateral partnerships around a particular product, but multinational, multilateral projects that really take into consideration the work we've done around the world and trying to tie that together.
I think there's a lot that we are doing, and there'll be more. India appears to be opening up some, for example, in terms of study abroad, bringing students here, joint research projects, the web making this so much more practical. We of course, but there's the way we're organized here, it probably won't happen, but some other countries would clearly benefit from it. We have from the beginning, almost the beginning, our education, our extension, and our ag research were all under the same roof. And that allowed, the extension went out, talked to farmers, heard what problems were, the researchers worked at them, and the teaching was to everybody, both outside and inside. I ran the USAID program for many years, and in so many countries, it's true in China too, by the way, you get extension, research, are outside the university, and often they don't meet. In a smaller country in Africa or Latin America, it's been a real problem. Now, countries are solving it various ways, but it's we learn, but we can teach continually.
Well, I think also it's worth pointing out there's a tremendous history of engagement internationally. The whole Green Revolution would not have occurred but for agricultural research here in the United States.
The germplasm for the wheat.
Dr. Borlaug and Warren Cronstad at Oregon State University revolutionized wheat varieties and crops. It revolutionized what was possible for us in the Pacific Northwest, but throughout India, Asia, the impact was profound. And I was very touched in the few times I've traveled to the Pacific Rim at the extent to which we have many former students, graduates, who now populate the highest positions in many of the natural resource agencies and governments throughout Asia.
I think unless the land grant and some other publics do their role again, we cannot double food production in the world between now and 2050, which is what almost all folks think is the target. We've got to have multiple green revolutions, really, to get there. Going back on the history, let's focus on the history. We're going to record all this. We got lots of ideas for the future, too, of course. Who's next?
Somebody in the back there.
Announce. I can't even see. Say who you are, please, for everyone.
Yes, Larry Goldberg, National Science Foundation. I had the privilege of attending Cornell University and learned there that it was both a land-grant institution and a private university. Was that unique, or are there other such examples?
I think it's unique.
Where's Hunter Rawlings? I saw him here. Hunter?
MIT.
MIT.
Yeah.
Hunter Rawlings, former president.
I heard
Well,
Yale.
And both members, active members of APLU, by the way, which would be appropriate. Yale?
Yale technically is.
You know you're in a great club when other people want to identify with you.
That's right. That's right. Okay, who's next?
Peter.
Yes, sir.
Well,
Peter, there's a
Brady,
lady
that
way
lady
back.
in the back.
You need to identify yourself, Brady.
Yes, Brady Deaton, Chancellor of the University of Missouri, the first public university west of the Mississippi River, and a university founded actually on the philosophy of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson's original tombstone sits on the campus of the University of Missouri. So I thought that was a very interesting historical background for what we're doing today. Also, the next time you enjoy a glass of wine, you should know that Missouri rootstock, because of the work of the experiment station, saved the global wine industry many years ago, and you will be enjoying the benefit of that in any wine you get from anywhere in the world. You can't escape the scientific progress illustrated in the land-grant mission of the University of Missouri. I wanted to also make a comment and ask for more comments on the international dimension, because as we look to the future and the economic development of our regions of the country, as well as our contributions globally, and Ed and Luann and others have commented on that very significantly, we are now very much drawing on a two-way flow of scientific information from around the world, as well as investment capital from around the world. And while we helped build a university in India, we are now benefiting from Indian entrepreneurs investing in our state and community. So I think that flow is very much what Luann Simon has called the World Grant University, and I think it bears us giving some thought to today. Thanks very much. A wonderful panel.
The public universities, land grant and other publics, in fact, do over 60% of the research that the federal government finances for universities. That's a figure that surprises almost everybody. And it's very clear that across the spectrum, technology that came out of or that universities were part of has created a huge part of our economic growth. There is extensive documentation, if you will, although these things always get disputed, that about 50% or more since 1945 of the gross domestic product comes from, has a root in, if you will, the technology from universities. The wine industry and a whole lot more, as we know. Other comments? Yes, sir.
And after him, that young lady in the back that's been standing for a while.
You can't see that far.
Need to tell us who you are, sir.
Bowden Contour. I'd like to follow up on the history and technology focus of land grant. We are a nation of immigrants. In 1890s and onward, there were a lot of immigrants that came here. One, I wanted to know what land-grant universities welcome immigrants and foreign students. I heard it was Michigan, and also what technologies are important now in land-grant universities. What science and technology developments
Who would like to respond?
I would respond for us. We're very proud that we are a top 10 institution in the number of international students and have probably a large proportion of undergraduate international students in many large research universities, and we're also in a top 10 leading nation in sending students abroad from a very middle-class background. 75% of our students are families of $125,000 or less. So it's the balance of trying to make Michigan State feel very international on its campus, at the same time having all these international opportunities for our students to go and work abroad in a variety of ways, and then the international partnerships for research and extension actually built over 50, 60 years. And so international needs to be part of our entire mission. And what we do then has to bring the best of the world to Michigan and the best of Michigan to the world. It's a relatively simple proposition.
I'll just say quickly, we've doubled the number of international students on our campus in the last 10 years. And when we talk about being inclusive and supportive, I tell colleagues it doesn't much matter what the demographics of where you are look like. If people feel they'll be valued and supported where you are, you can become a destination of choice for any group. And so we work very hard at creating a diverse and inclusive environment so that our students can work in a global economy and interact in a world that's ever more interconnected.
Yeah, we're in the same situation. We're on the top 10 list of students studying abroad. We don't have quite as many as they do at Michigan State coming from other places, though I think we're now over 3,000. We've carved out particular niches in China and in India, and are working very hard with three major African countries now, in Tanzania and in Ghana and in Liberia, with exchanges in both directions. In fact, I really think one of the greatest untapped resources of the 21st century will be the expansion of our relationships with Africa. And I think that's an area that many more institutions are going to become cognizant of.
Let's go back of the room for a quick question, and then there's a group up here in the front that I want to go to.
Well, first I have to thank my fellow Kentuckian who acknowledged me way back here. My name is Deirdre. I'm from the University of Kentucky.
Well. Go ahead, please, ma'am.
We're getting ready to celebrate our sesquicentennial in 2015, and I'm the co-chair of that committee. And I wrote down what Michael Adams said, was that he hoped to return to the idea that land grants were both a public and private good. And so I was curious how it's possible to reinvigorate our states, our communities, to that exact notion that we were founded upon.
A quick response, though. Everybody need not respond, because we know how strongly we feel.
Yeah, one of the things I want to pick up was a point that Peter made earlier, and some of our colleagues from the private universities are both private and land-grant universities. We're now in a great debate about what does it mean to be publicly purposed and largely privately funded, given what's happening to state funding in all of our states. We got to do everything else we can. We got to grow and diversify our revenue sources, philanthropy, research, other ways without putting the burden on the backs of students and their families. but we are in a crisis as a nation. We have to figure out how do we stay publicly purposed even as we become almost wholly privately funded. And I think the MITs of the world early on felt they had a public purpose even if they were privately funded. If we can't figure that out, given the demographic changes that are occurring, we are at risk of creating an underclass in this society who have no stake in it. And that's not a place that I think any of us want to go.
So well said. Okay.
Good morning. Is this on? Yes. Good morning. Barbara Couture, President, New Mexico State University. I want to follow up on the comment that was just made here about public purpose and about providing access for others. New Mexico State University is a land grant that was created in 1888 while New Mexico was still a territory. The state became a state in 1912 after 62 years of argument about whether it should become a state because of the diversity of its population. There was quite an argument over whether a group of people who included Native Americans, largely Hispanic immigrants, and farmers of low income, whether this kind of population was a suitable population for a group of people to become interested in becoming a state. Fortunately, New Mexico State did become a state in 1912, and New Mexico State University is the only land grant Hispanic serving institution. We sometimes argue with Riverside over that, and of course, Puerto Rico, well, not on the mainland, but also it is also a Hispanic serving institution. And New Mexico State University's regents, I'm very proud to say, also support the DREAM Act. And we haven't talked about that group of Americans and the importance of the growing Hispanic population in our U.S. and the growing population of immigrants, different kind of immigrants, who don't have an access to an education here. So let's also make that part of our mission. New Mexico State University also has 4 community colleges as part of its total mission, and that's also an area that we're being ever pressed to engage with as education progresses in the 21st century. So thank you.
I think the whole public university community feels intensely what Ed said so well a moment ago, that we've got to preserve our public purpose, and we feel strongly we've got to drive up those retention and graduate degree numbers. What a different place a campus would be if we did not think of ourselves as a public institution with a public purpose. It's just, it pervades who we are, and it can't be eroded for the future of the country. It would be a mistake. Okay, other questions? Yes, sir. We got Montana State right here. Oh.
Good morning. My name is Marie Ricketts, and I'm from Stratford, Vermont, where Justin Morrill lived.
Yes.
I'm the president of the Friends of the Morrill Homestead, and we are hosting a symposium on August 11th and 12th, where we will be discussing the future of education in America and the Land Grant Act. We invite you all to join us. You can find us by Googling Morrill Homestead, and I hope to see you in Stratford in August. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That's a wonderful event there. And tomorrow, as you all know, we have this convocation in celebration and looking to the future on the Morrill Act. And actually, there'll be 5 Morrill family members there, 2 recent students who will briefly speak to the group. So the Morrill family still survives and prospers with a great history. Okay, next right.
Yes, good morning. My name is Sharon Hart, and I've probably come the furthest as one of your presidents coming from the Marianas Islands. So I want to say thank you on behalf of those of us who are in the very, very far Pacific. It takes us a good 30 hours just to get here to Washington.
We're glad you're here, though.
So, well, thank you. But
you have a person there in the back.
But let me just say, first of all, on behalf of the U.S. territories, especially in the far Pacific, we want to say thank you, especially for my institution, where, of course, we are as well a land-grant institution. We appreciate that, because I will have to say that the challenges and the economic challenges, having, of course, come from the mainland my entire career until just a year ago, going out to the far Pacific, let me just say that the economic challenges, and I just have to say for a moment, the economic challenges in the far Pacific, I've never seen anything like it. And I will have to say that it is because of our land-grant mission that we do have an opportunity to serve our local islands and to help with the economic challenges that are going on there. But I will have to say, and I really appreciate David's comments, because I truly understand it is an institution that is really an Asian Pacific Islander institution designated as such, with 99% of our student population coming from that demographic group. But the challenges that we have are ones in those economic challenges of almost a push and a pull between our, I'll call it the traditional side of the institution and the land grant side. And because the land grant side gets the resources, where the other side of the institution, I'll call it the public side, right now we have literally less than half of the resources we had 4 years ago. We are serving double the population. When I arrived, all of my faculty and staff told me they haven't had a raise in 10 years. When I arrived, I took an immediate 10% pay cut because we had just gone on austerity Fridays every other week. So I think it's also very important that when we look at this, we also look at the economic challenges, because we are a land grant, but we also have that public and that local public support that we have to find and embrace. But because sometimes I truly believe there is almost a push and a pull going on, especially in those institutions of the haves and the have-nots. So I appreciate where the tribal colleges are coming from, because I believe they probably also come out of as very similar, sometimes financial challenges. It's great to have the haves, which is coming out of the land grant portion, but I think that somehow we've got to find the economic stability with the have-nots portion of our institutions as well. So I don't know if, David, if you've got any further comments on that, because I would imagine you're facing those same economic challenges.
I think that's a daily thing that we go through. It's always a challenge to find resource, and many of our staff and faculty wear multiple hats. You know, they're project directors, they teach. In some cases, we all chip in. On any given day, you can see me pushing a broom also. So those are the types of challenges that we have. But we do what we can to keep our doors open, because we're trying to provide opportunities for the individuals that otherwise might not have those.
Well, thank you both for your comments. There's a whole diversity of history, of problems and opportunities. It's striking in these public institutions. Good. Right down here with the next question.
Good morning. I'm Wadette Cruzado, president of Montana State University. And from my accent, you will determine that I was not born here. I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, actually in the city that's home to the land-grant university in the island, Mayagüez. And there's something to be said when you come from an island. There's something to be said when the only ways in which you can reach out and find other places is either by boat or by airplane. And yet, coming from a land-grant university opened the doors for me and for countless others. Actually, I think something needs to be said. Dr. Billington this morning revealed some very interesting facts about rum in our history. Well, let me tell you, every time that you buy a bottle of Puerto Rican rum, the tax money goes directly to the fund of the University of Puerto Rico, which is a great excuse to drink merrily.
We'll have to work harder at that.
Yeah, right. I also, and talk about opportunities. I think that we haven't dwelt enough in the fact that Morrill was such a visionary when he opened these opportunities, not only to the sons and daughters of the working families of America, but that it was going to happen in every state and territory of the Union. I am sure that the last thing that President Lincoln had in his mind when he signed the Morrill Act was that he was going to touch and transform the life of so many individuals in so many places, including in the ocean, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean or in the Caribbean basin. Actually, I remember growing up and seeing many students, not only from Puerto Rico, but from Dominican Republic, from Venezuela, from Colombia, from Peru, who went to Puerto Rico. And if you go back now to those places, you will find that the roads were built, that the farmers were grown by people who obtained their education at the land-grant university there. But then I was fortunate enough to come to Montana State University via New Mexico State University. And I always thought, well, why? And then I saw the Great Seal of the state of Montana, and I understood. Because right there, underneath the Great Seal, underneath the mountains and the rivers, there's a logo that says, and the big sky, there's a logo that says, Oro y Plata, gold and silver in Spanish. Now let me tell you about Montana State University, the oldest university in the state of Montana. Where's my colleague from University of Montana? Established in February the 16th, 1893. The oldest university by an entire day. The second thing that it's interesting is that there was this fight between the city of Bozeman and the city of Helena to determine which city was going to house the capital and which one was going to house the land-grant university. And the wonderful people from Bozeman chose well. They determined to have the land-grant university. There are several other things that tie Montana State University back to our state, to this story. Did you know that when you go to Stafford, and when you take a look at the handful of universities that back in 1961 decided to purchase back the Homestead Act, Montana State College, then Montana State College, was one of them. I'm very proud also to say that it was a former president of Montana State University, Dr. Michael Malone, who chaired the task force that enabled us to go to Congress to obtain passage for the 1994. And then the final thing, there are so many extraordinary alums from these universities that we could go around and around to talk about people who have transformed the world. We talked a lot about Norman Borlaug, the father of the Green Revolution, the man who fed the world. I'm very proud of an alum. His name was Maurice Hillman, class of 1941, born and raised in Miles City, Montana. His mother died when he was 2 years old. He grew up in the farm, in the family farm, and he loved chicken. And this is important for the rest of his life because he became a vaccinologist. But he could not aspire to go to college, and it was his older brother who insisted and found a way for him to get a scholarship to Montana State University. Well, the rest is history. Hilleman discovered the vaccine for measles, for mumps, for hepatitis A, hepatitis B, chickenpox, meningitis, pneumonia. Actually, of the 14 regularly scheduled vaccines, 8 were discovered by this graduate from Montana State University. It is claimed that he has saved more life than any other human being on the face of the planet. And like so many of our alums, this is the story that repeats itself. A man that almost found his way to education by an exception and became an exceptional man. Thank you so much.
You think so often as those say, well, we don't need more college degrees. There are people like that we need to have opportunity for so they can make their contribution to the world.
Dr. Adams, you had stated that you thought that the southern states didn't support the Morrill Act because it would have given them too much federal control. Do you think there was something in Morrill's timing of waiting until 1862 when most of the southern members of Congress were serving in the Confederate States of America instead of serving in the U.S. Congress, and that's why it was able to pass?
Well, I don't know the fine points of the politics. As you know, in addition to the whole issue of slavery, the issue of states' rights has been an issue in the South for almost as long as the existence of those states. I think it's fortuitous that the act passed. There was, in those days, opposition from many of the Southern leaders to any federal intervention in education. There are still elements of that, I regret to say, in our part of the country today, but I'm glad the act passed. I wish it had not taken the diversion of a 5-year war to remove those votes from the Congress, shall we say. So whether or not that was the determinant factor in the passage of the act, I don't know, but I do know that that thread has regrettably been a part of Southern politics for a long time.
Let me make a quick observation. I'm looking at the Library of Congress director here, so I hope I don't get this wrong. But I think the act passed under President Buchanan, and he vetoed it.
He vetoed it.
So it made it through Congress, but there was a sense in 1862 that Southern Democrats had been opposed, so that was less of an issue. But I think Justin Morrill was really, really smart. And one of the things he added to the Morrill Act that I think may have helped convince President Lincoln to sign it was that military training would become part of the land-grant universities. And those of you who know Civil War history know that, as a matter of fact, most of the really highly placed, experienced military leaders in this country were from the South and went back to the Confederacy, and there was a constant concern about how do we get good leadership in the Army of the North. And so one of the things Justin Morrill added was that ROTC training would be part of all the land-grant universities. Now, you know, it was a lot of years before it generated a lot of military leaders, but I got to believe that was an interesting hook that was added in a time of conflict that helped move it along.
Yeah, I don't think that hook was in the legislation that Buchanan signed, which really makes your point. I would argue that there was this conflict or difference of view between much of the South and the North as to the extent the federal government should have a role in economic development. Yeah. You know, it goes back to the tariff wars. It really goes back to the National Bank, Hamilton's National Bank, the assumption of debt and so forth. But that difference was there, and it's not just the Morrill Act that was passed in those early, after the South basically left Congress. It was a whole set. It was the Continental Railroad, it was the Homestead Act, the National Academies, USDA. It's not fair to say all the South, because certainly there was support for some of these things in the South. But this question, which remains a question yet today, interestingly, of what role the federal government should have in economic development is a great one, and it was reflected in the Morrill Act, which incorporated so much of the hopes and dreams of so many people. Let's go right here. We got a couple presidents I'd like to have. Who's got the mic? Oh, Jimmy.
Jimmy Cheek.
Jimmy Cheek, Chancellor of the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. This relates to our future as land-grant universities. Michael Adams talked about the Blueberry example, where that's a result of programmatic research designed to think about economic development. We don't do that very well in other disciplines. We tend to look at scientific problems, and then we tend to create technology. What can we as land-grant universities do in the future to do a better job at that across the campuses?
I think if you go back to the sort of the reference that Brady made to the world grant idea, part of what we need to do is think about cutting edge knowledge for the benefit of society and look at the portfolio of the work we do. And I think we have an opportunity in the celebration of the Morrill Act to commit ourselves not simply in agriculture or food or mechanical arts, but to commit ourselves to a sense of public good and a sense of work and listening about our research agenda that is about the spirit of the Morrill Act. And we're at a cusp, I think, for American higher education, whether that's divided among us in that responsibility or it's seen as something that is our future for the best of us.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Jimmy, and it's implicit in your question. We've argued for 300 years about basic research and applied research and all, and we certainly need both. But I do believe we're all going to have to become more aggressive and more articulate about both expressing to the public the results of the beneficial research in a whole range of fields that's being done, of our tripart mission of teaching, research, and public service. The research mission is still one that the general public has not a clue about what our real role is, and we've got to do a better job in that regard if we're going to have the level of support, given the disappearance of the moderate middle, which used to exist in politics in this town and is very rare now. But those are the kind of issues that I really think we're going to have to engage in the next 5 years if we are going to be successful in taking our total mission forward.
The land grants really have a capability to be engines of economic development and social progress in their states, but also nationally. And we need mechanisms to create a 21st century version of that. I'm sure we'll hear it in the discussions this afternoon and tomorrow. But for example, we've started an Office of Commercialization and Corporate Development, and the attitude is that's our land grant mission. We ought to be partnering with industry clusters to help bring ideas and products and services faster to market, to grow existing businesses, new businesses, and create jobs. That's what the people of Oregon and this nation need us to do. So we have to find the contemporary mechanisms to do things we've done historically in other areas.
We need to, unfortunately, I'm told we need to wind down here in a moment. And there's so many really great questions and people out here. But I wanted to recognize Secretary Riley. Can we get a mic right here? Who continues to be such a wonderful leader in education, higher education, particularly including the new chairmanship of this commission to look at regulation just in education.
Thank you so
Secretary?
much, Peter. Thank you, and I look forward to working with you in that regard. The complications of distance learning throughout our country. I want to thank the panel for a wonderful discussion and really some very enlightened questions also. I was especially appreciative of the discussion about the public role of our colleges and universities that we're all concerned about now and in our future. But thank you so much for making the Morrill Act mean so much to all of us. Let me conclude by saying to my friend Mike Adams that I appreciate the humility of your statement about peaches. I'm very proud of Clemson University, of course, in South Carolina, and the research that goes on there. We are confident that South Carolina produces many more peaches than Georgia, the peach state.
So, well, Governor, we appreciate your comments.
Thank you very much. It's great to have you.
I'm going to send you a case of blueberries.
Well, actually, we have the largest blueberry patent in the world. So.
Right. Okay.
It's amazing.
We need, yes.
Could I just check to see if Megan and Justin Morrill are in the hall today?
They're the students.
Yes.
The recent students.
Yes.
They'll be there tomorrow.
They will be here tomorrow.
Yes.
Good University of Nevada, Reno graduates.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. We went out and we found that we had some descendants of Justin Morrill, and they'll be right there. And thank you for University of Nevada, Reno for helping us identify them. Now let me close by asking Dr. Gregorian if you have some comments. We had a mic for Dr. Gregorian, right here. Can someone? Yeah, right here if you can, please. Thank
you.
This whole conference in session with so much of your vision, you and your colleague, Dr. Billington, that we're grateful and we're pleased that the APLU President's Council has been merged for the first part of your meeting. Thank you for all those things that you do, Doctor.
Well, I thank you. I'd like to congratulate you on your anniversary. This is a wonderful gathering. But I think Hunter Rawlings once addressed us, said we're talking to each other. We should be talking to general public. We have to educate America about what role you have played. Many of these things that you know, the public does not know. We are kind of in an amnesia, sort of. We're living in the present, detached from the past. And so that's one of the things we have to do if we are going to have any impact on the public. Second thing is, instead of just public higher education, we should also address issues of American higher education, because otherwise politicians will divide public and private, and therefore set each other, say they don't agree, they all want just money and so forth, get your act together. That will be disastrous for us. Third one is, which concerns me, but it's not the time to talk about, Morrill gave us, all Americans, a chance to go to people's colleges. But I detect now various public universities are charging students from other states twice, 3 times more to be admitted in their colleges. And we are also giving preferential treatment to foreign students. I was one of them, so I don't begrudge that. Foreign students, because they pay full fare. And the notion that we'll be having 1 million Chinese students to come to the United States next decade is great. But at the same time, we have an obligation also to give opportunity to American students to be educated, unless we say whoever gets educated must remain here to contribute to U.S. economy, society. So I have been there, so I don't want us to be divided and conquered, but rather divided will fall, but united we stand. As Martin Luther King said, since somebody quoted him, you did, I think, said, we came in different ships, but we're in the same boat now. Entire higher education is in the same boat. So as the boat rises, all of us will rise. I don't have stake here. As a matter of fact, I always have defended public higher education more than private higher education because I believe in it. This is a fundamental question for us to be able not to be pit against each other, but also to find solutions. Last point, Pete, I'd like to mention, we eagerly work with foreign universities, but we seldom cooperate with China and America. If you cooperate here, it's considered a sign of weakness. If you cooperate in China, India, Indonesia, and so forth, it's called a sign of strength. The time has come to eliminate our inferiority complex and deal with reality, to collaborate with each other here, with all the colleges, not just to use you as a gimmick for getting funds, but rather to integrate that in, because that will be essential. Thank you for giving me a chance to talk. Good luck to you. We're grateful you were here, and you're wonderful to educate so many generations of Americans. And one of the arguments you should make with Congress, we've educated every president, is product of America with rare exception of higher education. Every congressman, senator, Supreme Court justice, all of them are products of higher education of the United States. So take credit for them. Well,
thank you very much.
Or not. Or not.
I met 5 congressmen up here first.
This concludes this part of the program. The Council of Presidents of the American Association of Public Universities now will go across the hall to the members' room. There'll be people to show you where it is, but it's right adjacent. We're all supposed to go over there now, and the rest will stay here.
Good morning. My name is Ralph Cicerone. I'm president of the National Academy of Sciences, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be here with all of you this morning. I was very much intrigued and am very much impressed with the concept for this event that Dr. Vartan Gregorian and Dr. Jim Billington came up with, namely to look back 150 years to what was going on in this country, which was trying to decide whether or not it was going to be a country 150 years ago, and yet to take such forward-looking actions at that time, and to remind ourselves that every generation has struggles and crises, and that a wonderful characteristic of the truly great generations is that they look forward at the same time, and that's really our message today. We must be looking forward today as well. I'm going to introduce our introductory speaker first, and then afterwards I'll introduce the other speakers for our session. We are honored today to have Congressman Rush Holt with us today. Congressman Holt has been a member of Congress from New Jersey since 1999, and he's one of a handful, a very small handful, of individuals in Congress who's worked at high levels in science on his own. He's a physicist. He received his bachelor's degree, I think it was from Carleton College. He went on to graduate degrees at New York University and taught at Swarthmore in physics, also worked at the Princeton Plasma Physics Research Laboratory for some years. And in Washington, he's known as a conscientious, intelligent, quick, incisive, and responsible politician. Now, those are wonderful adjectives. I wish they applied to more people. But we're so pleased that Congressman Holt could join us today. I should say that many of you know that he's knowledgeable in many subjects and interested in many more subjects than just physics. One piece of evidence is that at one time, not too long ago, he was a 5-time winner of the game show Jeopardy! So be very careful when you challenge him to such pursuits. Congressman Holt, thank you so much for being here this morning.
Thank you, Ralph. I'm delighted to be with you all this morning. I always appreciate the imagination and creativity of Vartan Gregorian and Jim Billington, and I'm not surprised that they cooked up this really remarkable program, this wonderful idea. I would like to talk for a few minutes to try to put the Morrill Act, the creation of the National Academy, the Smith-Lever Act, and these associated things in the perspective of American character and why they are so important. These are observations and assertions, probably not well developed or well supported, certainly not up to the standards of the historians such as you will be hearing from today. But it's something that has weighed on me a great deal. I will, I think, talk about some of the backsliding and weakening of fundamental American characteristics, summarized by saying the American characteristic of thinking like a scientist. The Morrill Act, both 1 and 2, also the 1891 Morrill Act that was based on the flawed premise of separate but equal, the Hatch Act that provided federal funding for agricultural research, the Smith-Lever Act that was an obvious extension of the Morrill Act to provide a cooperative extension service, the Carnegie libraries in towns all across America were not only, I would argue, a democratization of education, but they were very much a democratization of science. They were a fulfillment of what was discussed in the Constitution. I always carry a copy, not because I don't know what's in it, but I like to keep it close to my heart. The Constitution is not very specific about very many things, but it talks specifically about advancing science and the practical arts. And this collection of legislation and creations are really very American. I mean, I think by that time, Andrew Carnegie was thoroughly American, no longer Scottish. And I will say a few words about my association with the National Academy and the National Research Council on the matter of anthrax as well. Americans have always been skeptical of politicians. I chose a decade or so ago to move into the least respected profession in America. You know, I've learned to weather the jokes that a politician's favorite color is plaid, or that he must understand both sides of the issue in order to get around it, or the Mark Twain quip that you know, imagine that you're an idiot. Now imagine you're a congressman, but I repeat myself. Well, anyway, we are at a particularly low point right now. And I think many of you would say that what passes for reason here, you might call spin. What passes for analysis on Capitol Hill, you might call assertion. What passes for debate, you might call posturing. All my constituents lament that there's a lack of compromise, and minds seem to be fixed in their ideologies, unmoved by evidence. Well, I want to point out that I serve in the House of Representatives, which is, if anything, representative. It is a distilled, concentrated kind of essence of America. And so when people say, wouldn't it be good if we were more open-minded, if evidence would trump ideology, I say, well, indeed, we are not finding that on Capitol Hill, but nor are we finding it on Main Street. It would be good if more people made their decisions and debated with an open mind and an eye on the evidence. In other words, thinking like a scientist. It really is an American tradition. And I don't just mean the pillars of Jefferson and Franklin and Paine and Madison and Benjamin Rush, obviously scientists. But I would argue that throughout most of American history, every shopkeeper, every farmer, every factory worker has to some extent thought like a scientist, asking questions so that they could be answered empirically and verifiably. Our very nation is based on this idea. The founders set up an experimental construction that was based on a self-correcting system with a pragmatic reliance on evidence. Evidence of what took us toward a more perfect union, that took us toward expansion of liberty and equality of opportunity. And with a provisional attitude and openness that is so close to what scientists espouse. There was the idea in this country that knowledge, learning, and experimentation were accessible to everyone. And it was on this basis that the National Academy of Sciences was set up. It was less a standard-setting, elite, aristocratic, honorary society, detached, than it was an institution to, collect practitioners who were on call for their country and their society. Similarly, the Morrill Act was quite obviously, as we discussed earlier this morning, a democratization of knowledge and the scientific method. That there was a principle that was widely accepted in America that science could be advanced by patent clerks and farm boys as well as by academicians and scholars, and that science could benefit the American experiment, just as America created the conditions that benefited the advancement of science. Because the two are really democratizing systems. And it worked. It has worked very well in this country, this democratization of science. One study said a decade or so ago that the investment in agriculture, both the land grant and cooperative extension service, yielded 15 to 20% return on investment. Well, I think in this day and age where you can actually borrow money at 0% interest, we might consider the benefit of such an investment. But in a larger sense, the investment in our society, the investment in the American ideals have paid off big. The science writer Tim Ferriss wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Science of Liberty. He pointed out that in the Federalist Papers, the word experiment was used 45 times, whereas the word democracy was used only 10 times. And he and others have quoted Jefferson, who pointed out that solutions are achieved not because wise men say so, but they're arrived at empirically. And in his words, reason and experiment have been indulged and error has fled before them. A good case can be made that science and liberty and equality of opportunity have grown up together in the United States of America. A United States, a country based on a presumption of progress. Progressive, not in the political party sense, but a sense that it was anti-authoritarian, that it was set up to avoid the stasis of monarchy and aristocracy, that there would be improvement, and the founding words of our document, toward a more perfect union. It was built on a sense of progress. The American dream that we hear so much about these days is so democratic and so scientific. And the Morrill Act was a natural step in this democratization, as was the national academies and then the NRC half a century later. The Morrill Act was based on the idea that the university would serve society. Now, of course, society then, when well over half the country was engaged in farming, meant agriculture. To serve society, not just to serve scholarship. Inclusive, tying thought to action, tying academics to society. Now, Americans have always had an anti-intellectual thread running through us, always skeptical of detached, as the saying goes, fuzzy-headed academics or ivory tower occupants, and the ridicule of such removed people is similar to the ridicule that members of Congress sometimes face. So Americans really have embraced this idea of farm boy scientists. Now, I hasten to say that, the United States has had some wonderful examples, some of the world's best examples of research in such institutions as the Institute for Advanced Study or the Carnegie Institution for Science, some of the research institutions here in the United States, and we've been able to have that kind of science, that kind of research as well. But as Don Stokes, the late professor from Princeton, pointed out in his book, Pasteur's Quadrant, there really is no inconsistency between curiosity-driven, so-called fundamental research and practical or directed research. And the eponymous example he gave was Louis Pasteur, who in everything he did was absolutely practical, even as he was the most fundamental, founding, you know, an entire field of study. We've been able to balance those two, and Don Stokes was able to, I think, point out the difficulties in imagining a one-dimensional arrangement of knowledge from basic to applied to manufactured and so forth. And the National Academy and the National Research Council have, I think, straddled this very well. So just as the Smith-Lever Act, creating the Cooperative Extension Service, was a natural extension of the Morrill Act, so was the creation of the National Research Council a natural extension of the National Academy. It's actually interesting and probably appropriate that it was an astronomer, so someone who might be called otherworldly scientist, George Ellery Hale, who was the principal mover in setting up the NRC. And they quickly, you know, the Academy and the NRC dealt with everything from the ecology of fur seals to the stability of banks along the Panama Canal against landslides, but especially devoting a lot of attention to military problems, ships' hulls and all sorts of other things. Oh, yes, and also early on, the NRC, I was pleased or interested to note, dealt with distracted automobile driving and problems of sex. So one of the things that Congress asked, actually not Congress, I beg your pardon, that a government agency, in this case the Federal Bureau of Investigation, asked of the NRC to look at was the anthrax attacks, the anthrax terrorist attacks. You may recall in the fall of 2001, Bacillus anthracis spores were sent by mail to a number of people around the country. Some of them even ended up in my office on Capitol Hill, and we were immediately thrown out of the office. And my colleagues said to me in the following days, well, you're a scientist, you must know about anthrax. Well, this really drove home the point that I want to make, which is this country that had been so integrated, in which science had been so integrated in society, had become a country not only with a wealth gap, but with a science gap. My colleagues, every bit as smart and able as I am, said, you're a scientist, you must understand anthrax, we don't understand that. Now, I scratched my head trying to remember where in my physics curriculum we had dealt with Bacillus anthracis. But the fact is, I did not hesitate to go out and get some medical journals and learn about the susceptibility of spores to infrared light and, you know, and other such things, which my colleagues could have done equally well, but they didn't. where did this come from? Where did this loss of democratization of science occur? I don't know, but in my experience, I would date it from 1958. The National Defense Education Act, passed in a panicked response to the launch of the Sputnik satellite. We said we would produce a generation of scientists and engineers, the likes of which the world has never seen, and we did. And we left behind about 80% of the population, saying, if you're not a scientist, don't bother. If you're not a scientist, no, you don't need to take advanced placement calculus. If you're not going to be a scientist, turn to the scientists for answers to these scientific questions. And that's what my colleagues in Congress do. So when a scientist like me comes to Congress, I'm something of an oddity. Now, members of Congress are not loath to speak and think about things in which they are not expert. And actually, you should be glad that's true. In a representative republic, but when it comes to science, they say, oh no, I'm not a scientist. I don't know about that. Anthrax? Holt's a scientist. Maybe he knows about anthrax. Rising above the gathering storm, a report from the National Research Council and the academies a few years ago got a lot of play, a lot of attention, talking about shortcomings in our education and our innovation. But they didn't quite put their finger on what I think is the real problem. It is, as I say, we have not just a wealth gap or an income gap in this country, we have a science gap. And the Morrill Act and that whole body of legislation and creation was intended to deal with that, to build on this integration of science in our society. And somehow we are losing it. And that is, I think, more serious than the loss of products to countries, to factories overseas, or the failure of US students to test at the top of international comparisons. I got involved in this anthrax because it was the first really major bioterrorism event in American history. You can point to some other earlier examples, sort of, but this was really important. And, as I say, it hit me directly. In fact, the letters were mailed from my congressional district. At least some of the letters were, we can presume. It's hard to tell because the investigation was botched so badly. It was an illogical investigation. It was based on collecting evidence to confirm a presupposition and hunches. Not what you would like to see if you were thinking like a scientist. So in February of last year, the NRC issued a report on the anthrax attacks, and it concluded that contrary to the FBI's repeated assertions since August of 2008, the available scientific evidence indicates that the anthrax used in the attacks could have come from sources other than their designated culprit. The FBI repeatedly overstated the strength of the scientific evidence linking this government scientist to the crimes, I should say. They said someone with less training and skill could have manufactured the anthrax used in the attacks. I mention that because it is such a good example of what I'm talking about. a failure to think scientifically about a really important, in this case, forensic investigation. So I would like to issue a call to get back to scientific thinking, to fully integrate science into our society the way that the land-grant colleges, the National Academy, the NRC were supposed to do, and did for a long time. So that in Congress, the representatives of the people of this country, when it came budget time, would say, okay, let's do the math and look at each other's budget. On climate change, let's debate the causes and the effects and the cost empirically. You say there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? Well, you know, if only the CIA and Congress had been more tied to the evidence, how much we would have saved. And tax cuts generate revenue? Well, show me the evidence. Anthrax and the way that investigation was handled had to finally go back to the National Research Council a decade too late to do the logical thinking, the evidence-based thinking that any scientifically grounded person would have asked for in the first place. Where were they? Where were they in the forensic investigation? Where were they in the congressional debate? So the institutions that we're celebrating today are so representative of this American characteristic that I think we need to recapture. It's not long gone, it's not far gone, but it's not strong. And my challenge to you is to find the way to recapture it. Thanks.
Congressman Holt, thank you very much for reminding us of our cultural, intellectual roots, which have relied so much on empiricism and experiment and challenging us for the future. That was very thoughtful and something that we are not going to forget. We will take that seriously. Let me just mention before we continue with the program that the National Academy of Sciences was founded in 1863, 1 year after the Morrill Act, chartered by Congress, signed by President Lincoln. So the same set of questions arises. How was it that the leaders of our country were able to move ahead, to think ahead, to provide the foundation and the infrastructure for what was to follow, namely a world-leading nation that would provide opportunities for all? This is the major theme of today and what we want to focus on for the future. We are really thrilled now. I want to introduce the next speaker and then tell you what's going to happen. The next speaker is going to take the bulk of our time for this session. We have invited him to do so because of his serious and innovative interest in these topics. When he finishes, Professor Barbara Schaal and I will join him and the panel to talk more about the future, I hope. But our next speaker is Professor Dan Kevles. Daniel Kevles is the Stanley Woodward Professor of History at Yale University. He also had served on the faculty at Caltech for some years before moving to Yale. His research and writings focus on the interplay of American science, technology, and society, past and present. He has been productive and interested in the history of physics, biology, scientific fraud and misconduct, plant and animal breeding, biotechnology, intellectual property, science, arms, and the state. Dr. Kevles graduated from Princeton University with a degree in physics, then studied European history at Oxford, and eventually received his PhD in history from Princeton, not that long afterwards, actually. He's written a number of books, including, quote, The Physicists, The History of a Scientific Community in Modern America, end of quote, and In the Name of Eugenics, Genetics, and the Uses of Human Heredity. Some of you may have seen his serialized pieces in the New Yorker years ago as part of a book also on the David Baltimore affair with Congress. Dan Kevles is going to speak about the second half of the 20th century now, focused not just on the National Academy of Sciences, but more broadly on what was going on in this country and the world, and why a base for scientific progress had to be laid, what it consisted of, and how that infrastructure has served us since then. So let's turn the podium over to Professor Dan Kevles, and thank you for being here, Dan.
One correction, I'm going to speak about the second half of the 19th century, not the second half of the 20th century. What's 100 years, right? So, first, it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here for several reasons. One is to participate in the 150th anniversary celebration of the Morrill Act and the recognition of its important successors in 1890 and 1994. Second, to do so under the generous hospitality of Jim Billington, whom I first met 50 years ago, and Vartan Gregorian, whom I've known for some 30 years, and also of Ralph, whom I met recently, but whom I've known about for a long, long time, and I admire them all greatly. And finally, it's a particularly special privilege for me, of a kind of sentimental nature, to be here doing this in the Library of Congress, especially this building. When I was working on my first book, The Physicist, I spent a year on D-Deck. I don't know whether that's open to anybody anymore, it was in this building. It had no windows, but the deprivation was far more than offset by the riches of all the books to which the denizens of D-Deck had direct access, and that probably is not the case anymore either. To turn to my subject, shortly before the nation's centennial in 1876, the physicist Joseph Henry, whom you see up here, long admired abroad as well as at home, a world-class physicist really, a one-time Princeton professor, and now for a quarter of a century, the secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, was stirred to reflect, "The surprise is not," to quote him, "that science has made comparatively little advance among us, but that it should have made so much." Now, a good deal of what Henry noticed arose from the new dispensations for science by the federal government. The federal initiatives had begun, of course, in 1862 when the first Civil War Congress passed the Morrill Act, about which we've heard, with its grant of lands to the states for colleges and universities that would offer studies in the agricultural and mechanical arts. And then in 1863, the same Congress, still in session, created the National Academy of Sciences, a private agency, as you know, with the public role of advising the government on policy-related technical issues. No less important, which you may know less about, in the years following the Civil War, the Gilded Age, as we historians call it, the federal government authorized multiple new research efforts and agencies, enough to constitute a huge expansion in federally sponsored scientific research and scientific services to the American people, including 4 different topographical and geological surveys of the far west. By the mid-1880s, federal science had accumulated sufficient prominence and power to warrant that telltale hallmark of arrival in this capital, namely the scrutiny of a lengthy congressional investigation. Henry's surprise at the expansion of science was altogether understandable given what it was like before the Civil War. In that period, astronomy, natural history, and natural philosophy, the term then used for physics and chemistry, was indeed a part of the required college curriculum, but science was in the main taught at an elementary level, along with the classics and theology as a tool of liberal education, rather than for its own sake. In all but a few institutions, notably the two service academies, RPI, and curricularly segregated parts of Harvard and Yale, its uses for practical purposes were by and large not only ignored, but in many quarters held in contempt. Federal science was, at the time, also minuscule. It comprised only the U.S. Coast Survey, which had been established in Jefferson's administration, the Corps of Engineers and the Naval Observatory, and an agricultural section in the Patent Office. And here's the Naval Observatory, which is now, as I understand it, the grounds where the Vice President of the United States lives. All were devoted primarily to research for practical purposes. In contrast, the Smithsonian Institution, a hybrid of public and private enterprise, was committed to the advancement as well as the diffusion of knowledge, and Joseph Henry, its secretary, emphasized the progress of abstract knowledge as best he could within his severely limited budget. He often regretted that so much of Smithson's endowment was given over to the construction of this Gothic pile of red bricks on what became the mall. Notable among his achievements was to make the agency a center for the gathering by telegraph. The telegraph came into use in the late 1840s, by telegraph of far-flung meteorological data, the collation and analysis of the data, and the issuance of daily weather reports, the first in the nation's history. Practical or abstract governmental research was at the time a pauper, that is, on the eve of the Civil War, a pauper of national investment, and scientists were scarcely considered indispensable to the conduct of federal business. Measured against this level of commitment on the eve of the Civil War, the expansion of federal science in just a few decades after the firing on Fort Sumter was huge, and it was game-changing for the scientific enterprise in the United States. And what I'm going to discuss in the rest of my time this morning is why did it happen, and what did it all mean for the place of science in the federal government and the relationship of the federal government to the advancement and diffusion of knowledge. Now, unlike the expansion that occurred after World War II, this 19th century transformation had very little to do with national defense. Its root cause was that the nation's circumstances were changing, as people have mentioned already this morning, in ways that established a mounting need for scientific and technological knowledge. Agriculture was growing ever more dependent upon mechanization, chemistry, and biology. The United States, you will recall, had expanded to the Pacific at the end of the Mexican War in 1846, and the encouragement of settlement in the new territories entailed the mapping of the new lands, the assessment of their natural resources, the establishment of military posts and transportation routes, the building of railroads, and the stringing of telegraph wires. That's why those surveys were initiated by the federal government. Withal, an increasing number of Americans recognized the need for an infrastructure of technical education and research and advice that would foster the progress of the emerging knowledge-based and technologically driven economy. These Americans comprised a loosely connected but determined coalition for training and knowledge. They included the educational reformers who found, as you know, a champion in Senator Justin Morrill of Vermont, eager to invoke the resources of the federal government to democratize higher education and orient it towards meeting the needs of the emerging age. At the center of the coalition were the leaders of American science, a small, internationally respected group. Prominent among them, in addition to Joseph Henry, were Harvard's Louis Agassiz, whom you see here on the right, a native of Switzerland and a brilliant student of rocks and fossils, and the geophysicist Alexander Dallas Bates, whom you see here on the left. He was Benjamin Franklin's great-grandson and also the head of the Coast Survey and an authority on terrestrial magnetism. And if there were a face-on photo that I had to show you right now, you would see a resemblance right through here with Franklin. In concert and separately, These men had shaped the course of American science since the 1830s, when Henry had returned from a kudos-filled tour of Europe for his work, vowing to Bache that, quote, the real working men of science in this country should make common cause to raise their own scientific character. By the end of the 1850s, Henry and his allies had been further energized in their ambitions by the rising intellectual ferment in science. Remember, they are scientists and they pay attention to what's going on in science. And this ferment included especially the recent theories of the evolution of the physical earth, and in 1859, just a year before Lincoln's election, Charles Darwin's extension of evolutionary theorizing, of course, to the living inhabitants of the earth. Eager to enlarge the contributions that Americans might make to these great subjects, the advocates of science wanted to improve its condition in institutions of higher learning and enlarge its opportunities in the federal government. During the decade before the Civil War, the South, as you've heard this morning, fearing any expansion of federal power, had blocked most initiatives along these lines, just as it had blocked federal investment in the building of transcontinental railroads, the promotion of industrial development, the provision of homesteads, and Justin Morrill's land grant bill. But after the South's secession from the Union in 1861, the way was cleared for the East and the burgeoning Midwest to form an imposing and powerful alliance determined to satisfy the pent-up demand for federal promotion of Western settlement and national economic development under the leadership of the recently reformed and now in power Republican Party. This was a GOP that, I might add, might seem a bit unrecognizable to us today. This was a GOP that was committed to industrial and economic expansion and was comfortable with the federal government's assisting the achievement of that goal across a broad spectrum of activities, including investment in human capital and the capital of knowledge. The advocates of science, their agenda fully in resonance with Republican aims, found considerable support in Washington during the boom years of the Civil War and beyond. The Morrill Act sailed through the Congress with large majorities, and so did the elevation of the agricultural section in 1862 from its subordinate place in the Patent Office into an independent department. In short order, training in agricultural and mechanical arts became formally a part of public higher education in the United States, breaking apart this standard uniform curriculum for liberal education, for which all students had to march in lockstep, by allowing for specialized study to advanced levels in science and engineering, among other subjects. The Morrill Act, while being about public institutions, nevertheless goaded all American colleges and universities into becoming democratically accessible engines of modernity. Indeed, private institutions of higher education, embracing a similar curricular reform to that promoted by the Morrill Act after the Civil War, gave comparable new attention to the sciences and their uses. So much so that Ralph Waldo Emerson remarked about 1870 or so, that a cleavage is occurring in the hitherto granite of the past and a new era is nearly arrived. Among the prime movers behind the creation of the National Academy of Sciences were Agassiz and Bache. Agassiz, the academic, saw in a national academy an institution that would raise the quality of science in the United States by granting the imprimatur of membership not to men of mere learning, but only to men of original scientific achievement. Bache, the longtime federal scientist, felt the need for an institution of authoritative scientists that would safeguard public policy making in an increasingly technical age from charlatans and pretenders. Joseph Henry opposed the creation of a highly selective national academy, suspecting that it might be considered, as he put it, at variance with our democratic institutions and might, as he added, become perverted to the support of partisan politics. However, without Henry's knowledge, Agassiz, Bache, and their like-minded allies drafted legislation to establish the academy, and they enlisted the support for it of Senator Henry Wilson of Massachusetts. A leader in the new Republican Party, Wilson was a passionate abolitionist, an ardent advocate of strengthening American prestige and progress, chairman of the Senate Military Affairs Committee. In all, he was a skilled and respected politico, and later, Ulysses S. Grant would select him to be his vice president. If Wilson spoke in the early 1860s, the Congress listened. And when he introduced the bill for the Academy on March 3, 1863, the last day of the congressional session, it cleared the House and Senate by voice vote and went on to be signed by President Lincoln that very same evening. Bates was elected the first president. Agassiz, elected foreign secretary, was thrilled, holding that the nation's men of science now had what he called a standard for scientific excellence. Henry, however, learning about this only after the fact, was far from pleased. He nevertheless accepted membership in the Academy, eventually came around to the idea of it, and agreed to be president in 1867 upon Bates's death. Patronizing research by rewarding success with titles and pensions was the European way and unacceptable in America, he noted. Still, he concluded that what he called an intelligent democracy could properly bestow honors for achievement, and the creation of the Academy had opened in America, as he put it, another avenue for the aspirations of a laudable ambition. Henry, however, was somewhat overly optimistic. The National Academy's financial resources in the late 19th century were severely limited, insufficient to publish more than an occasional proceedings and obituaries of its members. It met in the Smithsonian, here is a typical meeting, having no headquarters of its own, and the meetings were poorly attended. Moreover, federal requests for the Academy's advice were few and far between. But in mid-1878, at the Academy's initiative, Congress appropriated funds for the organization to prepare a report on the consolidation of the multiple surveys of the Far West, and in addition, to provide an overall plan for assessing and mapping the nation's territories. Within months, the Academy submitted 2 recommendations to the Congress. Here, by the way, is an example of the overlapping surveys. The black part is where they were all working together, sometimes in conflict. Within months, the Academy submitted 2 recommendations to the Congress. In one, it called for the unification of the 4 surveys, 2 of which were run by the military, into a single civilian agency. While the recommendation ran into opposition from vested interests in the military, the Academy's advice was compelling, not least because all of the surveys, at least in part, duplicated each other's work. In 1879, Congress did combine them all into a new agency, the United States Geological Survey. In its other recommendation, titled A Report on the Lands of the Arid Regions of the United States, the Academy called for management of the public lands in the West in accord with scientific knowledge of the region. But this recommendation, unlike the one for the consolidation, set off a political firestorm. It amounted to the first contest over climate science and public policy in the nation's history. The report on the lands of the arid regions was largely the work of John Wesley Powell, whom you see here, the intrepid geologist. Despite having his right forearm, losing his right forearm at Shiloh during the Civil War, he had achieved fame for his adventurous work in science, particularly his journeys into territories hither unknown to most Americans. He had scaled Long's Peak, braved the canyons of the Colorado, which you see here, and returned with valuable knowledge of the region, including maps. And this is where Powell started. This is the Green River up here, comes down, becomes the Colorado. All of this was unknown to white men, though it was largely known, of course, to Native Americans and to a number of Hispanics. But white men and women, in the East knew nothing about it. And Powell became famous for having making it known to everybody. And here is Powell and his party in the canyon of the Colorado as they were beginning one of their downriver journeys. Now, Powell was a staunch supporter of material development and economic opportunity, but he was also a social reformer. He empathized with the Native American tribes in the West and initiated what became a major program of ethnology to learn about their languages and customs. He was also convinced that scientific knowledge had to be deployed to accommodate democratic social progress to the realities of the land and its limits. Powell knew the American West well, partly because of the Smithsonian's meteorological and weather program. He was aware, especially, that the West beyond the 100th meridian experienced too little rainfall to sustain the conventional 160-acre homesteading agriculture that had long marked public policy. And here is a map drawn up by Joseph Henry using the meteorological data gathered by the Smithsonian Institution. And this, the dark part is heavy rainfall, the light part is virtually no rainfall, and you can see that west of this is the 100th meridian, west of the 100th meridian, there's hardly enough rainfall, hardly much rainfall at all, certainly less than 20 inches a year you need to sustain 160-acre normal agriculture. And here is a map of the region that Powell, I think, included in his report on the lands of the arid region. The colored regions are basically just showing drainage basins, but you see the red line is the 100th meridian. Now, so Powell says you can't sustain normal agriculture, that a kind we're accustomed to with 160-acre homesteads west of that line. However, a number of earth scientists, including some who were also veterans of the Western surveys themselves, thought differently. Drawing on European theories and their own experience, they contended that settlement and cultivation, especially the planting of trees, would transform arid regions, notably including the Great Plains beyond the 100th meridian, into fertile, loamy expanses bathed in rain like the agriculturally fecund Mississippi Valley. During the 1870s, as settlement spread westward through the Great Plains, rainfall did happen to increase, providing these arguments with a seeming plausibility and later giving rise to the summary phrase, "rain follows the plow." Powell dismissed these claims outright in his report on the arid lands, noting that many conjectures and hypotheses had been advanced to account for the increased rainfall. He went on, "Many have attributed the change to the laying of railroad tracks and construction of telegraph lines, others to the cultivation of the soil, and not a few to the interposition of divine providence in behalf of the Latter-day Saints." But he had to add, in what manner rainfall could be affected through the cultivation of the land, building of railroads, telegraph lines, etc., has not been shown. And here is an early declaration of the need for empirical evidence in the making of public policy. In his report, Powell called for an end to the apportionment of public land in 160-acre tracts. He urged instead the scientific classification of the land in ways that would allow for large sections suitable for dry land ranching and for irrigation farming. The contours of these large sections would be shaped by their access to water and their size. They would be up to 2,500 acres. And they would be determined by the use to which the land could be put, that is, mining, grazing, farming, or irrigation. Powell's report was made the basis of a congressional bill in February 1879 for reform of the land system in the arid region. It was introduced to the Congress by Representative Abram S. Hewitt, a respected ironmaster and friend of science from the East. He commended it to the House, declaiming that the plan came from, in his words, the highest scientific authority of the land. The measure was hailed by Eastern congressmen on both sides of the aisle as wise, realistic, and scientifically compelling. But representatives from the Western states and territories, ambitious inhabitants of a developing and settler-hungry region, ripped into the proposal. Had scientists said that the land was too arid for small farms, Congressman Martin McGinnis from the Montana Territory cried that theorists had pronounced the homestead system dead before yet settlers had gone west. And practical men all, in his phrase, had, again, in his words, seen the capabilities of this land which had escaped the notice of our scientists and statesmen. Did the proposal enjoy the imprimatur of the highest scientific authority in the land? Congressman Thomas McDonald Patterson from Denver, Colorado, argued that the National Academy of Sciences had, quote, never published but one work, and that was a very thin volume of memoirs of its departed members. He added, Pache, Ralph, he added to the laughter of the House, and if they are to continue to engage in practical legislation, it would have been very well for the country if that volume had been much thicker. In the end, Congress left the 160-acre base public land system intact. Congressman Dudley C. Haskell, a Yale graduate from Lawrence, Kansas, and these opponents of Powell's, of the bill were not yahoos. They were intelligent, educated people. Congressman Haskell said he did not mind giving science its little appropriation, but he had to say, now, if you want a geographical survey, if you want a lot of astronomical figures, if you want a lot of scientific material, then organize your geographical surveys and authorize them to get out there and dig and hunt bugs and investigate fossils and discover the rotundity of the Earth and take astronomical observations. But if you please, while you are there acting in the interest of science and in the interest of professional bug hunting, leave the settlers upon our frontier alone. Now, in fact, time would prove that McGinnis and his settlers had the matter absolutely wrong, and that Powell and the Academy had it essentially right. Here is a much more contemporary map of the average precipitation in the United States, and as you can see here, it's green and fecund, and out here, it's not. On the plains during the 1880s, rain ceased following the plow, ruining numerous farmers. Irrigation would prove indispensable to agriculture in the region. The battle we can obviously observe would not be the last to join contested theories of climate with passionate convictions of political economy. Yet for all their disagreements with Powell and the Academy, the congressmen from the West were not anti-science. What they objected to was the deployment of scientific authority to the end of what they disregarded as a radical or considered a radical change in their region's land distribution system. Their interests were economic, based on expectant hopes for rapid population growth and development. While they had their climatology wrong, they continued to value federal science highly for all the research, analysis, and information it was providing for the practice of agriculture and the exploitation of natural resources. Indeed, there were multiple indicators of Congress's ongoing enthusiasm for an expansive federal science. In 1871, it had authorized the Coast Survey to encompass geodesy by measuring the curvature and gravitational force of the Earth at its surface throughout the continental United States. This meant to measure that along an arc equal to about a full eighth of the circumference of the globe. In 1878, it affirmed this sizable expansion in the agency's activities and renamed it the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey. Congress also remained highly enthusiastic about an earlier initiative in the expansion of post-Civil War federal science, that is, the creation of the U.S. Weather Service, which it had established in 1870 in the Army Signal Corps. The Weather Service took over the meteorological work and methods of the Smithsonian. It served the needs of agriculture and the military, not to mention the American people in general. Army and civilian observers at stations around the country would wire reports of local conditions to the service's Division of Telegrams and Reports, which was housed in the headquarters of the Army Signal Corps on G Street here in Washington. There, the next day's predictions would be drawn up, then telegraphed out around the United States. And here you have the weather observing stations of the Signal Corps in 1870, everything sent back to Washington. And here you have a data sheet. Notice that the Army was sensitive to serving broad public needs. The this is the Division of Telegraphs and Reports for the benefit of commerce, not for the benefit of the Signal Corps. The reports were published in newspapers and tacked up at local post offices. And here you have the first storm warning in the history of the Weather Service. Sorry. I'll let you read it while I speak. The service also supported research in meteorology, encouraging the enlistment of college graduates and hiring civilian scientists. To the end of improving weather prediction, they explored the dynamics of storms and tornadoes and investigated the mysteries of the atmosphere. Congress's creation of the U.S. Geological Survey in 1879 was a clear vote of confidence for what the civilian surveys had accomplished before that. Apart from Powell's venture down the Colorado, perhaps the best known of them had been the geological and geographical exploration of the 40th parallel, which followed one of the expected routes of the Transcontinental Railroad. This was headed by Clarence King, an exceptionally bright recent graduate of Yale, who had studied under some of the country's best geologists. And here you see the route of the 40th parallel survey, which would become the route of one of the transcontinental railroads. King's survey was fruitful. Oh, and here was King on a mountain. King's survey was fruitful scientifically, and much of it was also economically pertinent, especially the geological investigations of the region in the neighborhood of the rich Comstock silver lode. One of the most significant economic uses of geology is precisely for what it tells you about the likelihood of finding minerals in the earth. King's survey, along with all the others, included artists and photographers. Their work was displayed in popular lectures with stereopticons and published in handsome books. And here you see some of them. Here is the west of the 40th parallel. Here is the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone in 1874. This is for people who had never seen these things, except for those who went out to them. And here is the Uinta Mountains in 1870. You can see the scale. There's a small figure sitting on the rock right there. These illustrations of the canyon country, the mesas, and the high peaks, by turns majestic, cathedral-like, and forbidding, held millions of Americans in thrall, much as pictures from space would rivet Americans a century later. King was appointed the first head of the new U.S. Geological Survey, but he resigned the post in 1881 and was succeeded by John Wesley Powell. Powell, his exploring days over, his body paunching, but his beard still a bristling red, fired the entire operation with enthusiasm. And here you see Powell looking more like a federal administrator. There's a wonderful portrait of him, I think, in the National Gallery in color with the reddish beard. He employed topographers, geologists, and paleontologists. He farmed out work to university consultants, a number of them at the land-grant colleges in the Midwest and the West and the South. Through its consultantships and field expeditions, the survey provided important research opportunities for many American geologists. Its access to the government printing office enabled it to publish hundreds of bulletins, valuable to both basic and economic geology. In fact, the government printing office was the most significant scientific publisher in the United States in the late 19th century. Powell could usually find a position in the survey for the relative of a well-placed congressman. He was no disdainer of Washington politics. He also distributed the survey's attractively and sometimes lavishly illustrated publications around the Capitol. With its numerous publications and consultants spread through 19 states and territories, the survey made its influence felt in numerous academic localities, and its work gained world-class distinction. By the mid-1880s, the federal government, with its venerable Naval Observatory, expanded Coast and Geodetic Survey, new Weather Service, and jewel of the U.S. Geological Survey, had become the home of much of American science. Relative to population, more scientists were working in the capital than in any other city, including Cambridge, Massachusetts. Washington scientists formed a congenial community, gathering at meetings of the various scientific societies, then proliferating in the capital, and conjoining at the Cosmos Club, which Powell, Henry Adams, and friends had founded in 1878 for people devoted to science, art, and literature. It was an intellectually stimulating community, and its members felt secure in the knowledge that through their work under federal auspices, they were contributing to the advancement of science, the nation's economic and cultural development, and the overall welfare of the American people. They were thus jolted in the mid-1880s, when the showpieces of the expanded federal scientific establishment, including the Geological Survey, were subjected to the congressional investigation I mentioned at the outset. No mere formality, this was an extended inquiry by a joint commission of the House and Senate under the chairmanship of the Republican warhorse, Senator William B. Allison, the powerful chair of the Committee on Appropriations. The investigation had been prompted in part by charges of scandal, favoritism, and wastefulness in the scientific agencies. But the fundamental issue was not scandal. It was whether the scientific agencies had developed beyond the limits of what the federal government should support. Critics contended variously that the scope of federal science had grown too broad, that the scientific agencies were engaging in abstract work of no utility. Such objections came from states' rights Southern Democrats, newly returned to the Congress from their exile, and from some Northerners, including several leading scientists. In the outspoken view of the critics, much of the research done by agencies like Powell's should be left to the states and to private enterprise. Federal scientists vigorously defended their work before the Allison Commission, insisting, as one put it, that they were not fomenting science. They were doing practical work for practical purposes. The National Academy once again asked for an opinion, tried to find a way to remove federal research from politics by recommending that it be consolidated under an apolitical Department of Science. The Commission rejected that recommendation because they thought it would inappropriately insulate science from the control of democratic government. But Senator Allison and his Republican allies did remain strong friends of federal science, and after 2 full years of investigation, federal research emerged from the probe unscathed. To be sure, to finish off what I wanted to tell you here, a few years later, Powell and federal science would suffer severe cutbacks at the hands of Southern Democrats, Western Republicans angered again by his insistence on managing public lands in accord with the needs of irrigation, and even some Eastern Republicans in thrall to cost-cutting in the face of emerging hard economic times, which became very severe with the Depression of 1893. But the setbacks to federal science were temporary. At the opening of the 20th century, with the Depression of the 1890s ended and the United States emerging as a world power, the expansion of federal science resumed, eventually to reach levels undreamed of by the scientists of Powell's day. The shape of that future, I hope I've persuaded you, had been set in the Civil War, when the Morrill Act was passed and the National Academy established, and during the Gilded Age, when federal science was so much enlarged with the influential vision of the National Academy in the case of the U.S. Geological Survey, and when the Allison Commission sanctioned the purposes and practices of an expansive federal role in science as a proper function of government. It was only a short step in time and principle from the affirmations of the Allison Commission in 1886 to Congress's passage of the Hatch Act in 1887. The Hatch Act, as you know, created federally funded agricultural experiment stations at the land-grant colleges and universities and marked the formal beginning of an explicit commitment to federal patronage for scientific research in the academic world. Powell had explicated the issue of the federal role in science before the Allison Commission with clarity and passion. Remember, he was a social reformer. Not even 100 millionaires could support the current research of the federal agencies, he declared, adding, the progress of American civilization should not have to wait on the philanthropic inspiration of 100 rich men. Surely, he insisted, The national government should support and publish whatever science advance the welfare of the American people. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kevles. Let me now introduce Barbara Schaal. Barbara and I are going to split up our last few minutes in talking about what we do today. Professor Barbara Schaal is the Marydell Chilton Professor, Distinguished Professor in the Department of Biology at Washington University in St. Louis. She's a leading evolutionary biologist. She's been recognized quite frequently for her work on the genetics of plant species and for the use of DNA sequences to understand evolutionary processes such as gene flow, geographical differentiation, and the domestication of crop species worldwide. She graduated from the University of Illinois with a degree in biology and went on to earn her doctorate from Yale University. She has served as president of the Botanical Society of America and for the president of the Society for the Study of Evolution. She's also currently, I'm very happy to say, the vice president of the National Academy of Sciences, and she serves as a member of the Council of Advisors on Science and Technology for the President of the United States. Barbara?
One of the things that we wanted to talk a little bit about are some of the current things that we do. And you heard a wonderful introduction how the National Academy of Sciences became very interested in, and really developed its mission to advise the federal government. One of the other hallmarks of the National Academy is that we've changed as the United States has changed. We've become much more, the science has become much more complicated, and that led to the establishment of the National Research Council, then the Institute of Medicine and the National Academy of Engineering. The U.S. is still changing, and one of the things that we see is a dialogue about many issues of science that really confront the public. These are such issues as whether or not to eat genetically modified food, whether or not the climate is in fact changing, what is the role of neurobiology in our emotions. And we see many things in the future that will be even more challenging, challenging not only to the federal government and the state government, and to scientists, but also to the general public. And so the National Academy of Sciences has become very interested in really expanding our reach from our traditional role, which is speaking to the government or speaking to scientists, expanding that so that we interact much more with the public. This is something that we've done a little bit in the past, but really, on some sense, rather ad hoc. Being the National Academy of Sciences, we're approaching this in a very scientific way. And about 2 weeks ago, we had our first colloquium on the science of science communication. And what that involved is really understanding the basic social sciences, the basic neurobiological sciences, in looking at how people form opinions, how they can change their opinions, and what are effective ways of communicating. And so we're really beginning to enhance our whole program. This is a real challenge for us, and I think, as many of you know, a lot of scientists would like to speak to the public, but we at times do it imperfectly. So how can we do this better? A number of things are going on right now. We're enhancing the way that we traditionally communicate by doing a much better job of expanding the reach of our traditional reports, but we're also trying to really develop products that speak directly to the public. One of those is one that's really been very interesting for us, is a series of publications, actually a revision of a publication, Science, Evolution, and Creationism. And in this publication, we have devised it for opinion leaders, for government leaders, for members of the teaching profession, and also for those interested religious leaders. And that's gotten a great deal of support from the public. And an earlier version of this, in fact, was used as the definition of science in the Dover case. We're also doing a series of brochures on what you need to know. And this is different for us because what we've done is a web survey asking the public, what scientific topics are you interested in? And we've had about 16,000 responses from the public on what are they interested in, and that is shaping the way that we produce these booklets. And the list of topics, number one was energy, second was climate change, there's interest in learning and education, and also water. And then finally we're doing some experimental programs where we talk directly to the public. One is the Science and Entertainment Exchange, where we interact with members of the entertainment community, mainly in Los Angeles and Hollywood, and we're basically a brokerage service. We provide members of the entertainment community with the names and access to various scientists to help them develop entertainment products that in fact are scientifically accurate and also, I think, portray science a little better. And one of the real advantages of this is the incredible enthusiasm that the entertainment community has. And we view this as a very worthwhile activity because I think, as all of us know, the entertainment community reaches very far and very wide in ways that the National Academy couldn't even begin to hope. And so this partnership is something that we're looking forward to. And because of the time, I think I'll turn it over to Dr. Cicerone.
Excuse me. Barbara and I have both been in our current positions for a few years now, and it's been absolutely striking to me and to Barbara. Both of us travel a fair amount internationally, but it's been striking to us that the more we learn about the infrastructure available in other countries, the way they run their affairs, the availability of nonpartisan advice and analysis for the governments, we see what a fabulous resource we have here. So when the idea was mentioned to us about this particular symposium, to go back and look at the conditions under which the Morrill Act created the public land-grant universities, and that Congress and President Lincoln created the National Academy of Sciences a year later. And then, of course, later this afternoon, we're going to talk about the libraries of the United States. It took on a new meaning for us because in all of our discussions with our foreign counterparts today, we realize what a fabulous advantage we have. We have been able to maintain a nonpartisan reputation as well as fact in the way we approach the issues that are given to us. The country remains fairly respectful of science as long as they see it as objective and evidence-based and not laden with opinions. And in that regard, we are visited by our counterparts from overseas very frequently about how people in different countries can possibly create what Congress created in this country 150 years ago. I can give you the names of 8 or 9 countries right now that are working on creating something like our National Research Council, which Barbara and Congressman Holt mentioned earlier today, which works with us. Excuse my voice, I have a cold. So we have a resource. We work very hard to maintain its credibility and its usefulness. And I will mention just a couple of things. We have a very light brochure that's available for attendees of this meeting, which is a list of selected reports that we have undertaken and finished in the last several years. And I'm looking to see whether the anthrax report that Congressman Holt mentioned is here or not. In fact, it isn't. It was a first-class report, though, led by Alice Gast, who's the president of Leahy University, and David Relman, who's a professor in several departments in medicine at Stanford, examining the evidence, as Congressman Holt said. But just to give you a sample of the topics that we're asked to undertake, and in almost every case, the request for us to undertake this analysis has come from a member of Congress, a congressional committee, the White House, different federal agencies and departments, and very, very few of these topics have we undertaken completely on our own without request. We find that for the most part, whatever the use is for our results, it's enhanced by being asked rather than just giving our own opinions. An exception is the booklet that Barbara mentioned, and great dissemination effort on science and evolution and creationism. We've made a policy decision for the last 20 years that when attacks on biological evolution enter the scientific classroom, that's when we enter. As long as those attacks and criticisms of biological evolution occur outside the science classroom, we have no extra voice in the matter. But we have entered into any number of disputes when those attacks enter the science classroom. But just to give you a variety, a sample of the variety, there it is. Under biology and life sciences, the #1 report that's summarized is the review of the scientific approaches used during the FBI's investigation of the 2001 anthrax letters. So we do put it in this recent summary. Under the topic of health and medicine, we examine not only basic biomedical research, but the delivery of health care, the effectiveness of interventions, the relative costs, and so forth, the management. There was a classic study called To Err is Human from about the year 2000, where we did an empirical investigation of the kinds and numbers of errors that occur more or less routinely in hospitals and clinics, and showed how those numbers can be greatly reduced. Last year we finished a report on, actually this year, chimpanzees in biomedical and behavioral research, to the extent to which the continued use of chimpanzees is justified as opposed to the downside of the research. The report recommended that all things considered, the gains to be obtained by the continued use of chimpanzees in biomedical research are outweighed by the disadvantages, and the NIH has since said that they will terminate the use of chimpanzees in biomedical and behavioral research. We do a lot of reports on education, and because of the, as Secretary Riley knows as well as anybody, the prevalent view in this country that the federal government does not have a central role in K through 12 education in each and every school district, many of the requests that we receive to study topics in K through 12 education come from other than the federal government, but we've done some influential studies on that subject. We did a report strengthening forensic science in the United States at the request of a number of courts in the United States. The topic is being very well received and stimulated by that report. And then any other environment and environmental studies, policy for science and technology, earth sciences, behavioral and social sciences, industry and labor, physical sciences, conflict and national security issues. We try very hard that each of our reports makes an addition, a substantial enhancement to what's already known. We try to certify results which are certifiable, of course, and we try to provide cautions to results and thoughts which are still not well enough established. We do not receive a congressional appropriation. The National Academy of Sciences and our sister organizations are private, nonprofit, although we exist to serve the government. So it's an interesting blend. The projects are often paid for by federal agencies and departments, but we do not receive a congressional appropriation. It creates a continuing kind of tension, which I think is valuable for the country. One other comment I'll make that characterizes our work is everything is peer-reviewed. We use a very rigorous system of peer review, whereby the peer reviewers are invited from the crop of outstanding experts around the United States and elsewhere in the world to review our reports before they're published anonymously. After the reports are published, we do list the names of all of the reviewers as a group, so that no individual reviewer's comments are attached directly to his or her name. We invest a great deal of time in this peer review system. We are not slaves to it. There are certainly times when the committee, the authoring committee of a report, will object to the tenor and direction suggested by peer review, and we have an appointed group of overseers of the entire review process that helps to make those judgments in each case. So it's through this enormously labor-intensive process that we ensure as best we can objectivity, value, and currency to the findings. I should say that individuals who serve on our committees, 3/4 of them are not members of any of the academies. They are experts and volunteers from society at large, and no one on our committees is paid. In every case, the service is pro bono. So in this way, not only does it capitalize on this American spirit of participatory democracy and of thinking like a scientist in the interest of democracy, but we also avoid all kinds of what could be complaints about conflict of interest or someone being paid to do this work. We do have a very vigorous conflict of interest policy, and before an individual is permitted to serve on these committees, he or she has to disclose anything that could possibly be relevant financially or previous public positions taken by that individual on the topic. So the system does involve a lot of overhead, but we have found time and time again, since before Barbara's time and mine, that this investment and this extra care taken in the way we do things pays off partly by problems that we do not incur later. So that's a brief summary of what we're doing, and we're trying very, very much to look ahead to the future, where other countries will be creating services, if you will, like ours, so that we can have more contact with them. But at the same time, it's been extremely useful for us to sit and listen to Professor Kevles, and in fact to some of the speakers on the Morrill Act earlier this morning, to remind us what it was like to try to build from very, very little base in education and research in this country and build toward the world leadership that we now enjoy, not only economically, but in terms of world governance based on objective analysis. And for that, we're extremely grateful for the privilege that's been given to us as an institution, and we try to defend it very vigorously. So we probably have time for just about 1 or 2 questions, including those which you might address to Professor Kevles and to Congressman Holt, and then I think we're bound to break for lunchtime. Do I see any takers?
I saw one over there.
No. I think not. So we will conclude this session. Oh, yes, sorry.
I wanted to thank you for your efforts on evolutionary science, because whatever our infrastructure is, all these surveys show that Americans are really far behind in understanding science. In those terms, I wondered, does the Academy involve itself with questions of what could be considered the philosophy or history of science in terms of the development of this very specific field within Western learning, and also in terms of sharing with the public how scientific consensus works?
Barbara, can you take that?
So I didn't get all of your question, but certainly the second part about sharing with the public how science consensus works. One of the things that we're working very hard on is to try to convey in a really effective manner how the process of science occurs. Because I think that's one of the real confusions that's occurring now in the public dialogue. The fact that science is viewed almost as just another value system, as opposed to providing information and facts based on a process. So there are a number of our publications that deal with that. And in fact, Science, Evolution, and Creationism, as I said, really gives the definition of science that has been used in a number of legal, in a legal example. Some of our education work also deals with the process of science and talking about scientific consensus and the idea of falsifying and moving onward after something is disapproved.
I'm being told that we really must break, but I'd like to call for another round of applause for Congressman Holt and for Professor Dan Kevles. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.